his mic, and his will start in a few minutes. And any questions? Get everybody's mic. Let me just remind everybody too about the while on the site. Make sure your background noise is down.
We can't hear you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, let me start over. Before we actually get started, let me just remind us of a few things that we want to practice proper adequacy for background noise being diminished as much as possible, so we didn't drown others out. Try and make sure your mics are off at all times unless you're the person speaking. And if possible, I recommend that you use a headphone or earphones if you're in an area where you can control the noise. And that'll be easy on everybody else who's trying to listen in to what's going on. Okay? And it's now picking up from somebody here. Yeah. I'm correct to getting feedback from.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. They put an earphones if you don't want to put earphones in, then you get that feedback. If Mr. Sullivan can put a pretty on it. Yeah. I'm gonna go off. Is off? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. All right. I'm about to open Mrs. Wolf's mic so that she can go ahead and do the prayer. And we'll begin with the prayers. Mrs. Wolf, I'm sorry. Mrs. Wolf?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you, Mrs. Wolf.
Okay. The Lord be with you and with thy spirit. Let us pray. Lord, have mercy upon us. Christ, have mercy upon us. Lord, have mercy upon us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Almighty God, who in thy wisdom and goodness has appointed the office of rulers and the parliaments for the welfare of society and the just government of men, we beseech thee to behold with thy abundant favor us thy servants, whom thou hast been pleased to call to the performance of important trusts in these islands. Let thy blessing descend upon us here assembled, and grant that we may treat and consider all matters that shall come under our deliberation in so just and faithful a manner as to promote thy honor and glory, and to advance the peace, prosperity, and welfare of these islands, and of those whose interest thou hast committed to our charge. And this we beg for Jesus Christ, his sake. Amen. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with all evermore. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mrs. Wolf. Good morning, members. Mrs. Wolf, you can do the announcements, and I'll just come in behind you. You can do like confirmation of minutes. I'll go ahead and do it. Members, the minutes from the 11th of March, the 13th of March, and the 16th of March have been circulating. Can we get confirmation as to whether they are correct as printed? Any omissions, any objections? And
Actions.
all your mics are muted if anyone has any comments. No comments? Those meetings will be confirmed.
Russell List is going to give you a call, and I'm going to send you a WhatsApp with the link.
Excellent. Your mic's on.
Yeah.
Okay. No comments. So the minutes from the 13th, the 11th, 13th, and 16th have been confirmed. The minutes from April 6th, April and 17th have been deferred. There are no messages from the governor, and the speaker has just a couple of announcements, and the announcements are first to ask the House to confirm the suspension of the standing orders to allow us to conduct this virtual meeting once again. And I'll also comment that between now and the next time we sit, the Standing Orders Committee will meet and ratify us being able to meet virtually. So we won't have to continue to suspend the orders on these occasions. The next announcement is that I suggest that all chairmen of the House committees work with Mr. Lamb and Mr. Stumner and make sure you can have meetings on the virtual space and using WebEx if you decide to go virtual for your meetings. And the last bit of housekeeping is that the invite for this and all Parliament meetings are to be considered as if we were sitting in the chambers, meaning the only persons who are allowed to sit in the chambers are members of Parliament. So the invite should not be shared with anyone. If it's going to be shared, it comes to the Speaker, and it's the Speaker's approval to share it first. But do not take it upon yourself to share this invite with anyone, because if we were sitting in the chamber, they would not be allowed into the House without the Speaker's permission. Thank you. And we'll now move on to the papers and communications of the House. Members, there are some 25 communications that are going to be put before the House this morning, and those are all in reference to the regulations surrounding the emergency measures policy. And I'll turn the mic over to the respective minister. I think the first few are in the name of Premier. Premier, if you could unmute and do yours. Then we'll have
Good morning, Mr. Speaker.
Good morning, Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honor to attach and submit for the information of the Honorable House Assembly the following regulations. Emergency Powers COVID-19 Shelter-in-Place Regulations 2020. Emergency Powers COVID-19 Shelter-in-Place Amendment Regulations 2020. Emergency Powers COVID-19 Shelter-in-Place Amendment Number 2 Regulations 2020. Emergency Powers COVID-19 Shelter-in-Place Amendment Number 3 Regulations. Emergency Powers COVID-19 Continuing Precautions Regulations 2020.
That's all yours, Premier. Thank you. I think the next regulations in name of the Minister of Finance, Mr. Dixon, you can unmute yourself.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker.
Good morning.
Speaker, I have the honor to attach and submit for consideration of the Honorable House Assembly the National Pension Scheme Refund Temporary Regulation to 2020, proposed to be made by myself, the Minister of Finance, in exercise of the power conferred by Section 24(9)(c) of the National Pension Scheme Occupational Pensions Act of 1998. Mr. Speaker, I have the honor to attach and submit for the consideration of the Honorable House of Assembly the National Pension Scheme Lump Sum Refund Retiree Regulation to 2020, proposed to be made by the Minister of Finance in exercise of the power conferred by Section 24(9)(b) of the National Pension Scheme Occupational Pension Act of 1998. Mr. Speaker, two more. I have the honor to attach and submit for the information of the Honorable House of Assembly the following regulations. Public Treasury Administration and Payments Temporary Unemployment Benefit Regulations of 2020. Public Treasury Administration and Benefits Temporary Unemployment Benefit Amendments Regulations 2020. Customs Duty Bermuda Paper Company Limited Remission Order of 2020. Customs Tariff Head of Department Customs Certificate of 2020. Customs Tariff Approved Business Amendment Notice 2020. Customs Tariff Approved Businesses Amendment Notice number 2, Notice 2020. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. And I believe that's all of them. Yes. Thank you, Minister Dixon. The next are in the name of the Minister of Health, Minister Wilson, if you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Speaker.
Good morning.
Mr. Speaker, I have the following motions for the presentation in the House of Assembly, namely Public Health COVID-19 Regulations 2020, Public Health COVID-19 Amendment Regulations 2020, Public Health COVID-19 Amendment Number 2 Regulations 2020, Occupational Safety and Health COVID-19 Temporary Regulations 2020, Residential Homes and Nursing Homes Amendment Regulations 2020, Public Health Communicable Disease Order 2020, Quarantine Communicable Disease Order 2020, Quarantine Travel Ban Order 2020, Quarantine Travel Ban Number 2 Order 2020, Quarantine Travel Ban Number 2 Amendment Order 2020, Quarantine COVID-19 Order 2020, Quarantine Incoming Traveler Order 2020, Quarantine Extension of Quarantine Order 2020, and the Nursing and Midwifery Amendment Rules 2020.
Thank you, Minister Wilson. And that is the introduction of all the papers and communication. Now move on to petitions. There are none. And statements. We have 7 statements this morning, I believe. The first statement is the name of the Premier. Premier, would you like to do your statement?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I turn to the substance of the statement, let me pause and invite honorable members to join me in thanking an often overlooked arm of public service, the Attorney General's chambers, and in particular, the drafting section. We have depended on them throughout this pandemic response to provide the legal framework for the rapidly evolving policies required in such unprecedented times. They have worked late into many nights turning around legislation and statutory instruments to ensure that we can keep our island safe. Mr. Speaker, as the order paper indicates, this honorable House will be invited to consider the Emergency Powers COVID-19 Continuing Precautions Regulations 2020. These regulations came into force on the morning of the 2nd of May, following the shelter-in-place similarly imposed by regulations made by the governor under the Emergency Powers Act 1963. Mr. Speaker, without reflecting on a previous debate, it is a matter of record that honorable members of the opposition insisted on having regulations properly made by the governor on the advice of the cabinet tabled in this House. As I indicated on that occasion and on the basis of advice that I received, the regulations are not subject to parliamentary scrutiny. Mr. Speaker, I am not of counsel, as they say, and so I will attempt to provide the layman's version of the legal research and the applicable views, which was the basis of the advice received and shared with honorable members. Mr. Speaker, it is correct that under Section 6 of the Emergency Powers Act 1963, there is a requirement for copies of regulations made under this act to be laid before both houses of the legislature as soon as practicable after they are made. The section then suggests that after some debate and by message from both houses, a request can be made of the governor to annul portions of the regulations. However, Mr. Speaker, the later Statutory Instruments Act of 1977 lists the Emergency Powers Act 1963 as one of those to which it does not apply. In other words, not subject to parliamentary scrutiny, whether by the affirmative or negative resolution procedure. The later act can be taken to have superseded the earlier one, and that section, Section 6, was impliedly repealed by the latter act of 1977. I would further note, Mr. Speaker, that unlike other items for which parliamentary scrutiny is intended, there is no requirement to publish as legislation or otherwise gazette regulations made under emergency powers. Honorable members will be aware that every order and every set of regulations made as part of this pandemic response have been published and gazetted for the information of the public in spite of there being no legal requirement to do so. Mr. Speaker, I understand that you are asked to formally direct the government to introduce all statutory instruments. Mr. Speaker, for the record, there is no need for any such direction, as I am pleased to have introduced for the consideration of this honorable House all such matters in this first regular sitting since we adjourned in March. Ministers of the government tabled 25 statutory instruments for information and consideration today. Mr. Speaker, constructive parliamentary scrutiny is welcome. Accordingly, I can further advise honorable members that Chambers has been instructed to produce a bill to amend the Emergency Powers Act 1963 and the Statutory Instruments Act 1977 to make the former act subject to the latter and require publication of regulations made thereunder in the Gazette. Section 6 of the Emergency Powers Act will be further amended to apply to the negative resolution procedure. This will ensure that in the future, there is absolute clarity on the matter of parliamentary scrutiny required for any regulations issued under a state of emergency. Mr. Speaker, it is generally accepted that no country has a perfect solution required to meet the challenges presented by the sheer scope and impact of this pandemic. This government has gone to great lengths to be bipartisan and transparent while discussing its decision-making with supporting public health advice. This will continue, as our firm view is that an informed people, both inside and outside of this honorable House, is the best chance we have of emerging stronger after this crisis comes to an end. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. The next statement this morning is in the name of the Deputy Premier. Deputy Premier?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Would you like to thank your statement?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr.
Go right ahead,
Speaker,
you got the mic.
I am pleased to report to this honorable House on the progress of the 6-megawatt solar farm at the Elephant Way International Airport. Just last week, the regulatory authority awarded an operating license to the developers of the project Saturn Solar Bermuda One, the Bermudian subsidiary of Saturn Power Incorporated. This is a significant milestone for the project. Mr. Speaker, honorable members may recall that work on the site began in August of 2018 with the commencement of the clearing of the site. The work in preparation for the actual development of the project began in 2016 with Castalia Advisors providing the consultation required for the project procurement. Mr. Speaker, you can be assured that every part of the solar farm was competitively procured for maximum transparency. We are pleased that this project has been regarded as a regional example of excellent practice in the tender process, which commenced with the pre-qualification of prospective bidders to ensure that all who bid for the project had adequate financial capacity and appropriate experience to successfully complete the work if they were successful in the final stage. Mr. Speaker, the project team led by the Department of Energy in collaboration with the Ministry of Public Works ensured that the project was de-risked as much as possible before and during the tender process, so that the critical bid factor, once all the other compliances were met, was completely based on the price. A crucial issue for this project team was to establish how much the rent would be for the land preferred to as the finger which the government is leasing at a fair market value. Another element of reducing project risk was to ensure that the project, which is located on the airport land, could be built and then operated in a manner compatible with operations. The site conditions were assessed by the engineering firm of On-Site Engineering to ensure that the ground was uncontaminated and had sufficient capacity for the development. When the bids were submitted, Saturn's bid was the lowest compliant bid at 10.3 cents per kilowatt hour. Mr. Speaker, honorable members will recall that because this project spanned two administrations, it was carefully scrutinized by this ministry and the Ministry of Finance to ensure that there was value for money and it best addressed Bermuda's needs. After that process, work to clear the site began. As honorable members may be aware, the finger had previously been used over the years for many purposes, such as a training site for active burn exercises by the Bermuda Fire and Rescue Service, an ammunition store for the Bermuda Police Service, and disposal area for debris ranging from asphalt screenings to disused fuel tanks. All the information had to be cleared before work could begin and the overgrown vegetation removed from the remaining perimeter. Once the site was cleaned and cleared, access still had to be reserved for other functions that could not be relocated, such as the United Nations Nuclear Monitoring Site, which is used to provide information on global atmospheric health. It is important to also note that the end of the peninsula will still be used for the disposal of explosives from time to time, but the developers are satisfied that these functions would not negatively impact the operation or safety of the solar panels. Mr. Speaker, construction began to install the solar panels on May 24th, 2019. Over 24,000 individual panels were installed, occupying close to 19 acres on the site. These panels are polycrystalline type with an additional layer of coating designed to shed water, which results in a self-cleaning effect when it rains. The panels were installed on a mounting system to raise them up off the surface of the tarmac and is intended to protect the panels from storm surge. The transmission cable on land is about 1 kilometer long, and the submarine cable is nearly 2 kilometers long and connects the solar farm to the grid at the Civil Aviation Substation on Kennedy Field Road. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to report that while the project was developed by Saturn, a Canadian company, the project was made possible by our local companies consisting of more than 50% Bermudian workers. The Bermudian companies working on the site included Noesis Consulting Limited, Christensen Engineering, Island Construction Services, Butterfield Excavation, On-Site Engineering, Security Associates, Fast Forward Freight, Bermuda Forwarders, and D&J Construction. We are proud to reach this milestone, and we look forward to the project's official commencement of operations, but there is still some work to be done. Moving ahead, the project will be operated by Saturn with the support of a Bermudian operations and maintenance contractor. While this will not involve a great deal of manpower, the commitment to ensure that Bermudians will continue to be included. Finally, Mr. Speaker, to be clear, the project will deliver power to the grid, not to the airport, and will not be customer specific. What this means is that all the states benefit from this power. We cannot know how many kilowatt hours will be produced, as it will be dependent on sun hours through the coming years. However, it is estimated that it will power the equivalent of about 11,000 homes per annum, stabilizing some of our volatile fuel costs and ultimately save about 150,000 tons of CO2. The solar farm will lower our island energy costs and also improve our environment. Most notably, Mr. Speaker, we are proud to have this project, the first of its kind in Bermuda, as an example of best practice for procurement and execution. This is the first step in introducing commercial developments to reach the goal of the Integrated Resource Plan, IRP, produced by the regulatory authority to eventually replace fossil fuels with energy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister, Deputy Premier. The next Minister has a statement this morning is the Minister of Finance. Minister, would you like to put your statement?
Pleases you, Mr. Speaker.
Continue on.
Mr. Speaker, before delivering update remarks on the government's COVID-19 fiscal plan, I would like to offer condolences to the families of those who have lost loved ones in this pandemic. I would also like to thank all of our frontline workers who are out there daily working hard, battling this pandemic, providing vital services, protecting our health and well-being, and keeping our island functioning. We are grateful for your dedication and commitment, and especially your bravery. Mr. Speaker, I rise this morning to provide this honorable House with an update on the Ministry of Finance COVID-19 fiscal plan, which was formulated to address the systemic effect that the COVID-19 pandemic is having on the economy of Bermuda, and by extension, government's finances. Honorable members will recall that on March 16, 2020, I advised this honorable House on the actions being taken as part of the Ministry of Finance COVID-19 fiscal plan. These actions were as follows: to obtain emergency financing to supplement reduced revenues and additional COVID-19 related expenditures, to provide additional funding to assist Bermuda's unemployed as a result of the economic impact of COVID-19, and to curtail lower priority expenditures to ensure that spending needed for COVID-19 matters can be maintained. Mr. Speaker, I also note that no spending reductions would be made that would jeopardize the health, safety, and security of the people of Bermuda. Bermuda's unemployed would be assisted, and fiscal prudence would be strictly maintained. To support these initiatives, debt ceiling was raised by $150 million to $2.9 billion during the final sitting of the House of Assembly, and at this time, net debt stands at $2.68 billion, leaving the government with approximately $220 million of borrowing capacity. Additionally, the ministry has executed a $20 million credit facility with a local financial institution and is in the process of finalizing another $150 million facility with that and another local financial institution. This borrowing capacity, together with current cash reserves and ongoing tax receipts, will assist the government in taking the appropriate actions to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 in the short term. Mr. Speaker, to assist people out of work due to the economic impact of COVID-19, the government has quickly introduced an unemployment benefit. The Ministry of Finance has worked closely with the Department of Workforce Development and our local banks to ensure that as soon as possible, money was made available for unemployment benefits. We recognized that time was of the essence. We have responded quickly to this crisis and have used the tools and resources at our disposal in a meaningful way to provide much needed financial assistance to our people during this unprecedented time. As of last Friday, the government had processed payments totaling approximately $15.6 million. Mr. Speaker, in the recently concluded 2019-2020 fiscal year, the Ministry of Finance provided increased emergency funding of $2.8 million to the Ministry of Health to fund, among other things, personal protective equipment, testing kits, and testing equipment. Additional funding has also been provided to the Ministry of National Security in the amount of $450,000 to fund the costs associated with the embodiment of the regiment and to provide quarantine facilities. A further $171,000 has been provided to the Ministry of Public Works, the Ministry of Legal Affairs, and the Department of Information and Digital Technology for other COVID-19 related matters. Mr. Speaker, to assist businesses that have had a pressing need for financial relief, on April the 3rd, the government announced several temporary emergency measures were instituted, which included extending deadlines for tax filings and deferring or possibly waiving of fees, taxes, and penalties. In many parts of the world, including Bermuda, the COVID-19 pandemic has negatively impacted companies of all kinds. Small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs, have not been spared. Many SMEs' business models depend on face-to-face contact and a physical location in order to drive their business models. With the actions required to address the current crisis, including the recently concluded shelter-in-place order, these businesses have suffered significantly, which in some cases resulted in job losses. Mr. Speaker, SMEs are an essential part of the Bermuda economy. SMEs, through the operation of their businesses, help stimulate economic growth by providing employment opportunities. Bermuda Economic Development Corporation has already taken actions, including grants and loan guarantees, to support these businesses through COVID-19 and beyond. The government will provide support in the amount of $12 million to enable the BEDC to provide resources to expand the programs now being run to assist small and medium-sized enterprises. Mr. Speaker, coronavirus has put the world economy at risk. The pandemic has unleashed both a global health emergency and an unprecedented economic crisis of historic magnitude. The economic impact of the pandemic public health measures required to suppress COVID-19 is causing severe economic shocks in all directly affected economies, including Bermuda. Mounting economic indicators and opinions suggest that the economic hit will be considerably worse than the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. Mr. Speaker, honorable members are advised that at a press conference on April the 18th, I advised the following. Considering the impact COVID-19 could have on all sectors in the Bermuda economy and the projected level of unemployment, the Ministry of Finance, working with the Caribbean Regional Technical Assistance Center, or CARTAC, has revised our growth forecast from 1% to 2% to negative 7.5% to negative 12.5%. It is important to note that this was the preliminary projection based on reasonable assumptions and was primarily dependent on how long the intensive but very necessary suppression measures remained in force. The IMF, in their World Economic Outlook on April the 14th, have predicted the global economy will contract by 3% in 2020 and 5.9% in the United States. More recently, IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva have offered an updated assessment stating in an interview with the BBC that 3% may be a more optimistic picture than reality produces. Notably, for the first time in the IMF's history, the organization now has a team of epidemiologists helping them in the development of macroeconomic projections. The economic impact of COVID-19 will also have severe knock-on effects on the 2020-2021 budget. The combination of lower fiscal revenues and higher public spending is expected to cause the projected budget deficit of $19.8 million to increase. Mr. Speaker, based on submissions by ministries and Ministry of Finance projections, unbudgeted COVID-19 expenditures for this fiscal year are estimated to be in the range of $70 to $80 million and consist of the following. $20 million estimated for the Ministries of Health, National Security, Legal Affairs, Public Works, and the Cabinet Office Departments. $44 million estimated for expenditures on unemployment benefits. $12 million grant to the Bermuda Economic Development Corporation, and $10 million estimate for possible call on airport minimum revenue guarantees. Mr. Speaker, COVID-19 will also cause a major decline in government revenues. This is caused both directly by the economic slowdown and indirectly by tax policy and administration measures taken in response. The ministry estimates that revenue yields for 2020-2021 could contract in the range of $175 to $200 million. After factoring in the impact of COVID-19, the revised deficit for 2020-2021 is estimated to be in the range of $275 to $315 million. This deficit is not only unsustainable, but economically and fiscally imprudent. When considering the high current level of public debt, the Ministry of Finance regards this level of deficit as a serious challenge. Total net government debt outstanding could rise to approximately $3 billion, which is $100 million above the current statutory debt ceiling of $2.9 billion. Mr. Speaker, I am all too conscious of the significance of our debt rating and the impact of a potential rating downgrade. Therefore, we must be judicious in the use of additional debt and keep an ongoing active dialogue with the rating agencies. Accordingly, the ministry's target is to keep the deficit for 2020-2021 below $175 million. The previously mentioned COVID-19 budget figures assume that government takes no action with regard to reducing allocations approved in the 2020-2021 budget. However, Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Finance COVID-19 fiscal plan calls for a re-examination and reduction of lower priority budget expenditures to ensure that spending needed for COVID-19 matters are maintained and the deficit is contained within a level to maintain credibility with the rating agencies and investors. Accordingly, savings are being identified in the following areas. Delay for an additional 6 months the start of any capital projects that have not commenced. Continue the freeze on the funding of vacant posts that are not required to address COVID-19 or to protect Bermuda's national interest. Continue the ban on non-essential government travel and reduce all discretionary spending, including grants, consultancy, training, materials and supplies, clothing, uniforms, etc. To reduce the deficit further, other temporary payroll or government employee overhead savings will have to be considered. Mr. Speaker, on Monday, May the 5th, government held discussions with our union partners, at which time the Ministry of Finance made a presentation on the economic and fiscal situation facing our country. These talks were fruitful, and I'm convinced that all parties understand the need to collaborate to develop solutions to the fiscal challenges that we are dealing with. Mr. Speaker, through the initiatives mentioned above, the government has already identified an estimated $50 to $60 million in potential savings, and we're looking forward to working with our union partners to identify even more. Mr. Speaker, COVID-19's impact have made the 2020-2021 budget presented and approved in this Honorable House no longer valid. Honorable members are aware that in accordance with Section 96 of the Constitution, the Minister of Finance is required to prepare and submit to the House of Assembly as soon as practical before the beginning of each fiscal year estimates of revenue and expenditure for the upcoming year. The estimates of expenditure are debated and approved in the House of Assembly, and after the estimates are approved, an appropriations law is introduced in the House, which provides for the initial authority to pay from the consolidated fund. The Minister of Finance has the authority to designate funds in excess of amounts appropriated or for a purpose for which no amount has been appropriated, and subsequently prepare a supplementary estimate showing the amount of additional expenditure required or spent. Honorable members are aware supplementary estimates require a similar approval or ratification process as expenditures approved in the annual budget. To offset some of these additional COVID-19 related expenditures, departments will be required to identify areas for savings and set up environments to transfer funds across ministries. Mr. Speaker, to ensure that costs are managed and reduced appropriately, the Ministry of Finance will enhance its ongoing budget monitoring and control exercises. To ensure greater transparency, I will be reporting to this Honorable House on at least a quarterly basis on the overall financial performance of the government's revenues and expenditures. Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Finance recognizes that to navigate appropriately through this crisis, we will require the input and advice of all stakeholders in the community. The Ministry of Finance has increased its interaction with stakeholders in the public and private sectors to obtain views from business leaders about industry sector performance and their outlook. This will assist in the development of our economic recovery plan for COVID-19. Additionally, the Ministry of Finance has already engaged with the Fiscal Responsibility Panel to seek their feedback. Further, on April 10th, the Ministry of Finance and the Bermuda Monetary Authority convened an emergency meeting with the Financial Policy Council to discuss COVID-19. The purpose of this special meeting of the FPC was to provide a forum for preliminary discussions and advice to me as the Minister of Finance and the Bermuda Monetary Authority on the possible impact of COVID-19 developments on the financial stability of Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, another FPC meeting was held on April 30th to build on the discussions from the April 10th teleconference and seek to provide more specific advice to me and the BMA for members on the recommended course of economic policy actions for Bermuda to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19. Mr. Speaker, to build on the momentum from the FPC meeting, I can confirm that I have established a COVID-19 Economic Advisory Committee. The committee will include key stakeholders in the Bermuda economy and community. The role of the COVID-19 Economic Advisory Committee is to provide insight and expert advice to identify measures to enable sustainable economic growth and mitigate the social impacts of the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, with every threat, there is an opportunity. Therefore, the COVID-19 crisis must be seen as an opportunity for a profound shift. Any COVID-19 reform program must be multi-pronged. It is also important that this plan be far-reaching, comprehensive, and supported by a broadly based consensus across all the key stakeholders, including the trade unions and church groups. However difficult it may be, opting out from taking tough decisions at this time is no longer an option. The Ministry of Finance will continue to evaluate probable economic scenarios, including economic circumstances that may result in even more severe reductions in business conditions, employment, and government revenues. This will allow for further temporary emergency measures to be taken if necessary, so that government can maintain essential services and continue to service the needs of our community as required to protect our national interest. Mr. Speaker, when you consider the long view, Bermuda has been in business for 500 years. Our legacy is strong and a vibrant one. Our people and many of our businesses are resilient and strong in character. I am confident that if we all work together, Bermuda and her people will emerge from this crisis stronger. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I wish to once again thank all of our essential workers and everyone who is on the front line, working day and night to ensure our health and well-being. We are grateful for the sacrifice and dedication of all of those wonderful people keeping us safe, keeping this island operating while putting their own safety at risk. Thanks also to those businesses and individuals who are so generously donating funds, resources, and supplies to assist in our efforts to fight this virus. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. The next minister on the list this morning to give a statement is that of the Minister of Works. Minister Birch, would you like to unmute and give your statement at this time?
Mr. Speaker?
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, it was only a few short months ago that the world was hit with a pandemic that would bring life as we know it to a grinding halt. And although we like to think of Bermuda as another world, we were not immune to this crisis. Mr. Speaker, similar to major events that changed the world in times past, such as World Wars I and II, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and more recently, the 9/11 attacks in the US in 2001, that dramatically changed the way in which we travel. It is anticipated that COVID-19 pandemic that landed on our shores in March will further impact our travel habits. This pandemic has also changed the way we communicate, the way we socialize, and the way we conduct our daily business. For the foreseeable future, we can no longer shake hands. We cannot fist bump or do the bro shake when greeting one another. Mr. Speaker, these interactions were replaced with elbow bumping, foot tapping, to the new reality of physical distancing that requires us to remain 6 feet apart. Who knows what we may, who knows, that may be a good thing. In-person meetings are now replaced using technologies such as Zoom, WebEx, and LifeSize. Mr. Speaker, some may have thought that the shelter-in-place conditions brought the island to a standstill. However, the business of the country, and in particular the functions in the Ministry of Public Works, had to continue as they are critical to the operation of this country. Without the monitoring and maintenance of our water and sewage system, the 24-hour, 7 days a week operation of the Tynes Bay Waste-to-Energy facility, to the daily collection of garbage, Bermuda would experience major infrastructure challenges and health issues. With that brief introduction, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to take a few minutes this morning to acknowledge the hard work of several teams within my ministry who had little rest during this shelter in place, and I consider them our heroes without a cape. Mr. Speaker, I'm in no way saying things in the ministry are perfect. You may recall shortly after we required persons to self-quarantine from overseas travel, the team in the waste management section expressed serious concerns that one of their colleagues returned to work without following those guidelines. My permanent secretary, the president of the Bermuda Industrial Union, and I had several meetings with the waste management team at Marsh Valley in an attempt to allay any concerns. It was agreed that the workers would return to work the following week, March 30. I must thank at this time Ms. Loretta Cartwright for attending those meetings at short notice to sign for our hearing impaired employees. To ensure garbage was collected that week, the management team of the waste section immediately reached out to a number of private organizations and contractors who quickly agreed to assist the country at that time. Once again, I would like to extend my thanks to the corporations of Hamilton and St. George and the private contractors who ensured garbage across the island was collected with minimum issues. Mr. Speaker, during shelter in place, the ministry was also tasked with coordinating the efforts of seamstresses across the island to produce face masks. Two members of our headquarters team, Mrs. Trina Bean and Mrs. Georgette Trott, along with Mrs. Sheila Terrell, who brought the idea to us, and Ms. Gay Simmons, quickly formed the nucleus of our face mask team. Shortly thereafter, the ministry received numerous offers of help from private individuals who simply wanted to help. They have produced over 1,000 masks between them, free of charge, which have been donated to the hospital, 9 nursing homes, the police service, Bermuda Regiment, and 6 community groups. It is my pleasure to acknowledge and thank them for their generosity and community mindedness. They are Mrs. Belinda Brown, Mrs. Nancy Frith, Mrs. Lee Hall, Mrs. Renee Hill, Mrs. Cynthia Canahan, Mr. Patrick Mahon, Ms. Rochelle Minus, Mrs. Cindy Patterson, Mrs. Marilyn Sanamon, Mrs. Karen Skiffington, Mrs. Nancy Thompson, and Mrs. Sheila Terrell. Mr. Speaker, to ramp up the testing of residents for the coronavirus, the team in the building section, led by Mr. Sheridan Ming and Mr. Dalton Burgess, collaborated with Dr. Karika Velden to design and build the new lab, all while she was in quarantine. The team contracted Bermuda Drywall and Sealing to complete the lab preparation works by converting a part of the health lab at Southside into a COVID-19 testing lab in 3 days. This second lab would now be used to support the government's efforts with having as many persons in Bermuda tested for the virus. The lab was now operational, but the drive-through testing site still required some work. Once again, our team, along with the BLDC team, pulled out all the stops to ensure this drive-through testing facility was up and running on Friday, April 24. A special thanks to Mr. Stephen Tucker, who has worked tirelessly to ensure the site became fit for purpose, as well as ensuring the medical team and scientists had all the equipment and supplies they needed. A team of doctors led by Dr. Kaiwan Brown, along with Dr. Amne Fogo Asaran, Dr. Cindy Morris, and Dr. Jeffrey McLeod, ensured the process ran smoothly. They were assisted by an amazing group of 14 young medical students, all but one of whom are young ladies. They are Ms. Toya Anderson, Ms. Neil Bailey, Ms. Deja Burgess-Simons, Ms. Dacia Keynes, Mr. Taj Cox, Ms. Elizabeth Davis, Ms. Talia Sumner, Ms. Sakara Phillips, Ms. Sajale Riley, Ms. Jade Robinson, Ms. Nafisa Robinson, Ms. Keandra Simons, Ms. Kirsten Steed, and Ms. Kayla Wilkes. Mr. Speaker, the ministry was also tasked with assisting the third sector with the delivery of meals, supplies, and computers to seniors, water and food to those in need, to driving the seamstresses across the island to secure materials, to delivering face masks to those in need. I'd like to say a big thank you to Mr. Nathan Darrow, our transport supervisor, who always displayed a positive attitude, and no matter what the challenge, the first words out of his mouth were, "Not a problem, we'll get it done." The ministry received several requests from residents that ran low on water, so the Corey team, led by Mr. Obama Carmichael, quickly responded by delivering several truckloads of water. Mr. Speaker, securing personal protective equipment, or PPEs as it is more commonly known, remains an issue globally. However, our purchasing and finance team worked with a local company to secure face masks of surgical quality from an overseas vendor. As such, the ministry liaised with the Ministry of Health with the end result being a joint order for PPEs being made. From this order, the ministry received several boxes of face masks on Monday of this week and expect a few more shipments over the next week or so. Mr. Speaker, the Bermuda Housing Corporation, BHC, instituted enhanced 24-hour security at all of the rooming houses during shelter-in-place. The BHC also issued face masks to their clients to adhere to the new protocols, provided transportation for those in need to go grocery shopping. In addition, while preparing contingency plans in event quarantine was needed, emergency accommodations were prepared should they be needed. The BHC also provided administrative assistance to Dr. Karika Weldon at the Southside Lab. The Hustle Truck provided assistance where needed. The Bermuda Land Development Company provided assistance in setting up the COVID-19 testing lab at Southside, administrative support to Dr. Weldon, and assisted Belco with support of a blown transformer at Southside, which disrupted the power supply that would have resulted in power outages. Mr. Speaker, the Public Lands and Buildings team assisted with filling requests from Dr. Weldon for the sourcing of required lab items, which included the fabricating of units in our carpentry shop to be used for storing sampling kits at the drive-through testing center at Southside. The Prospect Depot also assisted with fabricating the mobile hand sanitizer stands that are presently positioned at key entry points to government buildings. Public Lands and Building team also provided internal improvements for the refit of a government-owned residential property used for quarantine by the Ministry of National Security, set up a new lease for the Fort Knox building at Southside for the new warehouse facility for COVID-19 stores, worked with BHV and the Ministry of Health and donated materials and equipment for the setup of the new stores, and worked with the Department of Workforce Development with facilities set up for the COVID-19 unemployment benefit program. Mr. Speaker, with the shelter-in-place eventually coming to an end, it was important that the government be ready for what this would look like. To that end, our team was tasked with drafting the government reopening protocols. A special thanks to Mr. Derek Simmons and Ms. Zoe Roberts in the ministry, who worked alongside the Department of Health team to produce these protocols. Highlights from this document speak to the taking of body temperature before entering a government building, wearing a face mask before entering the government building, use of hand sanitizer, specific use of elevators depending on the building, 1 or 2 riders at any given time, the use of stairs where possible to reduce the risk of spread and social distancing while in the workplace, and social distancing while in the workplace. There are also markings 6 foot apart on the ground outside each government building for customers' convenience to adhere to the protocols. Some services that were closed are now open, such as the Torrance Bay drop-off, the airport dump facility, and the Marsh Valley composting site. I'd like to thank Mr. Clarkston Trott and Mr. Nasir, the respective team leaders of Marsh Valley and Torrance Bay, for their oversight and support during this shelter-in-place. Mr. Speaker, the finance team and the ministry were equally busy during this time. They were responsible for managing the government's vehicles to enable other departments to achieve their mandate, procuring key supplies such as masks, as well as continued services for regular goods and services, including fuel supply, onboarding, termination, and other transitions of key members of staff, and visits to our communications towers to ensure they were working in under no threat when the shelter in place. I'd like to specifically thank Ministry Controller, Ms. Joanne Smith, who was in the office daily assisting the teams to carry out their duties. Mr. Speaker, the Land Title Registry team worked remotely for the most part, but was still able to provide a search facility to stakeholders on the information we held electronically going back to the year 2000, to complete 160 land title registration applications, and continue working on creating registers for the 58,000 scan deeds registry documents. So, Speaker, the REDCO office continued to operate normally throughout the shelter phase by ensuring REDCO's infrastructure, water, and sewage operated 24/7 and provided emergency repairs when and where necessary. Mr. Speaker, the Land Valuation Department activities during the shelter in place include the ongoing work with the 2020 revaluation project. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank all the members of the Public Works team who stepped up to the plate and did what was necessary for us to do our part during this time of crisis for our country. Many demonstrated what will become the new normal. Those who are willing to step outside their comfort zone and do what is necessary to get the job done will have the greatest success. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister Birch. The next statement on the order this morning is that of Minister Berger. Minister, would you like to present your statement?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker.
Right ahead, Minister.
Thank you much. Mr. Speaker, May is a time when the whole of Bermuda traditionally looks forward to celebrating Heritage Month. It is the time of year when Bermudians come together to celebrate our heritage, our culture, our family connections, our national pride, and our national unity. It is a time for festivity and togetherness. It is a time to reflect upon who we are as a people. Mr. Speaker, the impact of COVID-19 means that Heritage Month 2020 must be observed in a way that we have never done before. The decision to cancel the Bermuda Day Parade for this year was difficult, and it was sobering, yet entirely necessary in order to safeguard the health of our people. However, as we face this unprecedented threat, there is even a greater need to recall the original intention of Heritage Month, of celebrating our culture, family connections, national pride, and unity. Although we are currently bound by the need to physically distance ourselves from each other in ways that sometimes feels alien to us, this does not mean that the core ideology undergirding Heritage Month must be cast aside. Mr. Speaker, you will recall that the theme for Heritage Month is We Are Bermudian. And it is an extremely worthy theme to embrace during a time when we are living history. Now, more than ever, is a time to remember who we are and what we stand for when we say we are Bermudian. Mr. Speaker, in light of the constraints on gatherings of people, the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs has given consideration to the kinds of programming that will achieve the goal of celebrating who we are whilst keeping Bermuda safe through physical distancing. This will be achieved primarily through partnering with creatives, tradition bearers, artists, and cultural institutions and other government departments to provide virtual content of interest to a broad sector of our community. This will include the preparation of traditional foods, readings of Bermudian stories, enjoyment of Bermudian music, various arts and cultural challenges, and more. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs will also work with CITV so that we can provide the public with a Best of the Bermuda Day Parade to air on Friday, May 29th, highlighting some of the most beautiful floats and memorable dance troupes of our iconic parade in previous years, as well as content for a lineup of cultural films and events to be screened in the lead up to the Bermuda Day. Mr. Speaker, culture and the arts provided us all with a major source of emotional and spiritual sustenance through shelter in place, bringing us entertainment as well as a reservoir of inspiration and togetherness during a time when many of us were feeling isolated and discouraged. A significant number of Bermudian musicians, entertainers, artists, DJs, historians, tradition bearers, and creatives provided us with visual happy hours, TikTok challenges, virtual lectures, sip and paint events, Instagram live concerts held in living rooms, virtual art galleries, and so much more. As the minister responsible for culture, I would like to publicly acknowledge their efforts I have been impressed and proud of our creatives who quite spontaneously, organically, and effectively utilized their talents and stepped into the breach to give our people what we needed. Despite this, Mr. Speaker, it is no secret that during times of economic stress, cultural institutions, artists, and other creatives often take a financial hit. With this in mind, during Heritage Month, the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs will also spearhead a number of national conversations with creatives and cultural institutions to further a dialogue on how arts, culture, and heritage can best remain viable and vibrant during the development of our new normal. Mr. Speaker, at the conclusion of Heritage Month, the department will unveil a brand new website which will serve as an invaluable tool for members of the public, students, creatives, researchers, and educators to utilize. The department has a treasure trove of materials and information on Bermuda's culture and heritage. The website will provide the vehicle through which this material can be easily accessed, along with updates about the exciting new programs that the department is currently working toward, with the intention of developing our creatives, preserving our heritage, and celebrating our people. Mr. Speaker, it is my hope that during this Heritage Month, just as the community appreciates the extraordinary efforts of frontline workers, including doctors, nurses, farmers, grocers, and others to keep our bodies healthy, safe, and nourished during this time, that we will also acknowledge the efforts of our artists and creatives in keeping our minds and spirits engaged, positive, and inspired. Mr. Speaker, these are not easy times for Bermuda, but part of our cultural birthright is the long legacy of strength and resilience that we have to draw from. We are a people who are agile in the face of challenges, generous to our neighbors in times of trouble, and innovative with our solutions to problems. That is what we truly mean when we say we are Bermudian. I am immensely proud of who we are. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. The next minister has a statement this morning. Is that of Minister Simmons? Minister, would you like to do your statement?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Speaker.
Morning.
Mr. Speaker, today I would like to provide this honorable House with an update on the very valuable public feedback and contributions that we have received during our management of this COVID-19 crisis. Mr. Speaker, this government is committed to providing members of the public with the opportunity to offer their ideas, suggestions, and indeed their opinions. We welcome the input from those who we serve, as we recognize that we do not always have all the answers. This, we believe, is a healthy practice in a democratic society, and we have therefore created avenues during this COVID-19 episode for our citizens to express their views on how we can best achieve economic and social recovery. Mr. Speaker, through a variety of means that we have provided for the public, our citizens have expressed their views quite candidly and freely. This is a clear sign that people understand the significance of their vested interests and the need to be a part of the solution. The vehicle used for this purpose is the Citizens Forum at forum.gov.bm. We have found this to be quite effective in enabling our citizens to express their views without impediment. Mr. Speaker, the public was asked to provide suggestions to stimulate Bermuda's economy once the shelter-in-place ended. To date, we have received 136 submissions, which generated 184 ideas. Additionally, these submissions generated 109 comments, with the vast majority of those, 107, showing support for the ideas submitted. Mr. Speaker, we've been very impressed by the substance and innovation contained in these submissions. Clearly, individuals have shown a keen interest in making a contribution to the recovery of our country post-COVID-19. Mr. Speaker, I hasten to add that many of the comments have been quite laudatory of the manner in which this government has handled the COVID-19 crisis, a dilemma that has posed extraordinary challenges to every segment of our community and economy, and indeed the entire world. I want to identify the source, but this is a direct quote from one of the responses we received. Quote, David Burt, the Premier of Bermuda, cabinet ministers, career government leaders, and other public and private sector executives have done a tremendous job of managing the unmanageable COVID-19 pandemic. A debt of thanks is owed to all of them, as well as to frontline workers for protecting our community's health, families, and well-being in this uncertain and fast-changing environment. Mr. Speaker, of equal importance are the excellent optimistic ideas for economic recovery we have received from members of the public, which we intend to explore. Some of these ideas include the following: a call on global executives and job creators such as reinsurance and leaders to join the national effort to rebuild Bermuda's economy, leverage the expertise and international perspective of these figures to enhance Bermuda's competitiveness in the global market, incentivize job growth, manage the gradual reopening of our economy, facilitate a restaurant business partnership to jumpstart our local food and beverage industry, use our stable government leadership during COVID-19 as an example of a positive attribute to promote Bermuda around the world, pursue globally significant institutions and personnel to make Bermuda a regional hub for innovation and excellence in 21st century educational methods and curriculum, creation of high streets in Hamilton Dockyard and St. George's, changes to import duties on certain items, beachside dining, Bermuda star rating for hotels, legislate minimum standards for hotels, increase local food production, changes to our tax structure, resurrect our boat building industry. Mr. Speaker, these are but a few of the numerous thought-provoking and wide-ranging submissions we have received from all quarters of our community. It is very encouraging to see so much interest from such a diverse cross-section of Bermuda, and augurs well for us as we strive to work our way not only through this pandemic, but beyond it. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the government, I offer my sincere thanks to all those who have submitted their ideas and for taking the time to provide such thoughtful and cogent suggestions. This government is committed to being inclusive, and we recognize that we do not have a monopoly on good ideas. I would therefore like to encourage those in our community who have not done so already to please weigh in with their ideas and welcome input from everyone. They can do so by going to forum.gov.bm. Let me repeat, that is forum.gov.bm. Mr. Speaker, the government wishes the public to be aware that their contributions are valued and that there are some that we are already examining closely to determine how best they may be incorporated into the government's plans going forward. In closing, I'm extremely proud to note the significant number of submissions we have received, and more so the very encouraging message of unity this whole process has registered. That unity is what will not only get us through this crisis, but also provide a solid foundation on which to build and sustain our economic and social recovery. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, I note that there's a second statement by yourself. Would you like to do that one or not?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Continue on.
Mr. Speaker, the objective of communicating during a crisis is to get clear and accurate information to as many people as quickly as possible. This ensures those receiving the information are well informed and know exactly what they are supposed to do and when. Ideally, the facts must reach the audience wherever they are comfortable getting their news. Mr. Speaker, increasingly people are turning to online platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and WhatsApp to get their information. Groups share links and graphics that interest them and feel would be of interest to others. Short video clips and voice notes are other popular methods to quickly get specific details to large numbers of people. However, Mr. Speaker, there is a group of people who are not using modern technology and rely on the radio, television, and printed word to stay informed. Additionally, there are people who have special needs, such as individuals who are hearing impaired, who equally need access to vital life-saving information. The role of the Department of Communications is to make sure each group has the information they need when they need it. Mr. Speaker, very early in the COVID-19 crisis, government's Department of Communications moved to quickly educate the public about COVID-19. DC provided basic information about hand hygiene and cough etiquette while giving details about what COVID-19 is and how to stop the spread. Working closely with the Ministry of Health, they devised guidelines for industry so they in turn could take action to help prevent the spread of the disease in their establishments. Mr. Speaker, I believe that things happen for a reason. In late February, the Department of Communications, working with Government House and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, provided training in Bermuda on communicating during a crisis. The Department's communications officers, together with the U.S. Consulate General, U.S. State Department, and local agency partners, participated in a day and a half of theory and practical experience. That training provided useful and practical tools for the attendees and gave reminders on what to do during a crisis. The lessons were indeed timely and provided those in attendance opportunities to make connections and develop crisis communications plans that were to prove invaluable within the coming weeks. Mr. Speaker, my statement today aims to shine a bright light on the tireless work of the Department of Communications. Since the start of this pandemic, DC has worked hand in hand with the Ministry of Health to help flatten the curve of this epidemic so as not to overwhelm Bermuda's hospital and medical service. The Ministry of Health is to be commended for their hard work in response to COVID-19, and likewise, I heartily commend the Department of Communications. Since March 1st, 2020, the government has held 47 press conferences. The Premier has given 2 national addresses. We have issued 173 COVID-19 press releases and 225 press releases altogether. We created 40 public service announcements and recorded and posted all press conferences. We designed more than 600 social media and other graphics. The Tree Frog app was downloaded by almost 2,000 people, 965 from the App Store and 974 from Google Play, and the team answered hundreds of media queries. Mr. Speaker, the public may not be aware that each day members of the media send questions based on stories they are writing or producing for the next news cycle. For example, at one point, the Ministry of Health received almost 40 questions in one day. The Communications Officer for Health is responsible for consulting with the technical officer at the Ministry of Health to get the correct answers. The responses may require research in order to provide accurate information to the news outlets and ultimately to the people of Bermuda. This is an extremely time-consuming exercise, and all involved must be recognized for working in collaboration to support local media. Mr. Speaker, the activity undertaken by the Department of Communications so far has resulted in the highest viewing of government data on the government portal and since we launched the social media platforms. Let me begin with the portal. We developed the coronavirus.gov.bm and gov.bm/coronavirus, which are on the same page on 12th of March. Since then, 169,75 users have visited the page in over 324,208 sessions. There have been 564,000 page views. 77,227 of the users are from Bermuda, while 57,291 are from the U.S. Between them, they had almost 500,000 page views. I shall now give details on the top 3 figures on Facebook. Facebook views on video. On the 1st of April, 44,900 views, the Premier's national address, shelter in place, announced. March 18th, 17,300 views, press conference announcing various closures in Bermuda. 30th April, 16,200 views, Premier, Minister of Health, Minister of National Security via Facebook Live. Public service announcements on Facebook, 23rd of April, 22,700 views, athletes shelter in place video. Confused about do's and don'ts of COVID-19 video, 22,300 views. How to protect yourself from COVID-19, 17,700 views. Since March 1st, the communications team has posted the following on each social media platform: 430 posts on Facebook, 640 Twitter tweets, 100 posts on Instagram, 11 posts on LinkedIn, and that's a total of 1,181 posts. Mr. Speaker, on Facebook, the government currently has more than 10,700 followers who have viewed more than 2 million minutes of videos. There have been 34,000 video engagements. Video engagement defined as the length of time viewers watch a video and then participate in some action around the video. For example, liking it, sharing it, or commenting on it. In general, on Facebook, there have been 29,000 reactions, 18,000 comments, 6,100 shares, and more than 53,000 engagements. On Twitter, we have 4,291 followers, 1,000 retweets, and more than 2,700 engagements. On Instagram, we have more than 3,700 followers, more than 3,200 likes, and 3,200 engagements. Mr. Speaker, on 23rd of March, the government launched their WhatsApp service. Anyone who signed up to 504-6045 and sent a message that said hi has received messages from the Department of Communications on what is happening with COVID-19. In the last 6 weeks, the total numbers of messages sent, including broadcasts and response to query, is 325,978. The service has received 11,400 messages from subscribers, and as of yesterday, there were 5,250 subscribers. What should be noted, Mr. Speaker, is this global pandemic has created a lot of communications firsts for Bermudas, including the first time we've had daily press briefings, the first time we've had speakers in multiple locations going live on Facebook and CITV, the creation of a purpose-built space for press conferences taking into account the need for social distancing. Mr. Speaker, other than press conferences and the occasional photo shoot, the team has been able to work effectively from their respective homes without any interruption service. Mr. Speaker, clearly I can continue to highlight the outstanding work of the Department of Communications, but in the interest of time, I shall shorten this statement. However, before I close, I want to recognize the people in communications who have made these staggering statistics possible. The Deputy Director of Communications, Nia Talbot, who is the Communications Officer for National Security, the Cabinet Office, and Labor, Community Affairs, and Sports. Health Communications Officer, Helen Zollner. Helen has been seconded to health during this crisis. Communications Officer for the Premier and Finance, Honey Adams. Communications Officer for Education and Legal Affairs, Tina Evans Keynes. Communications Officer for Public Works and Tourism and Transport, Michael Brangman. Communications Officer for Home Affairs, seconded from the Bermuda Police Service, Mr. Robin Simmons. The Internal Communications Officer, Courtney Bushner, who has also become the Social Media Officer during this crisis. The Deputy Director, Creative Services, Keno Simmons. The 3 graphic designers, Deleon Grant, Jamie McDowell, and Suzette Salesman. Our photographers, Stephen Rayner and Jason Swan. Our photo librarian, Michelle Dismont Fazzoni. Mr. Speaker, the team at CITV comprises General Manager Janelle Ford, Program Manager Al Seymour Jr., Senior Producer Robert Zool, Television Editor Asha Ludwig, our videographers Nick Kamen Spence and Calais Steve, the government switchboard operators, also part of the team, Senior Customer Services Representative Maureen Crockwell, and Customer Service Reps Patsy Lewis and Ryan Smith, Administrator Officer Gainell Weeks, and Accounts Assistant Kimberly Spencer. Carleen Lodge, the Cultural Affairs Program Manager in Community and Cultural Affairs, has been seconded to communications and had sole responsibility for the WhatsApp phone service. Mr. Speaker, I have not mentioned the portal's management team who have been a part of the department since 2016 and have been instrumental in designing the COVID-19 page on the government website and developing all the online forms which government has produced in the last few months, allowing the organization to function paperless. They are Assistant Director of Portals, David Wellman, Portals Administrator Travis Smith-Simons, and Kalia Nesbitt. Mr. Speaker, this team of highly qualified, hardworking, and dedicated professionals is led by Director Adaranka Batamosi Wilson. Mr. Speaker, I've had the pleasure of serving as Minister of Responsibility for Communications since 2018. During that time, I've been assisted greatly by the leadership of our Director of Communications, Adaranka Batamosi Wilson. Her advice, adaptability, unwavering capacity to simply get things done, and her patience with the minister, who I'm told can be quite demanding, have all been at an impeccably high standard. That standard has been raised even higher during what has been an unprecedented time when demands on her and her team have been like never before. The way that her team has stepped up and met the call during this pandemic is a reflection not only of a strong team effort, but the leadership of Director Wilson in helping to make it all happen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Excuse me. Thank you, Minister. And that brings us to a close of the ministerial statements this morning. We'll move on to the next order on the order paper, which is reports of committees, and there are none. Moving on from there, the next item is that of the Premier's question period. And although it wasn't noted on the order paper today, this is the second Friday of the month, which means there's Premier's questions. And I know both whips haven't missed it because we've already received a list of members who wish to ask questions of the Premier. Mr. Premier, there are some 10 members who have indicated that they were looking for questions this morning. And we'll have recent amendments to the standing orders, just to remind members that the Premier's questions will last for 30 minutes, separate from the 60 minutes of the normal question period. Afterwards, the opposition leader gets to ask 3 questions with 2 follow-up supplementaries, and all other members can put 1 question and 2 supplementary questions when they are recognized to speak. And part of the other amendment is that the response from the Premier will not exceed 3 minutes, and I have a time clock that we will run. And just to note the time now as we start the question period, the Premier's question is now 11:19. And Premier, I'm going to call on the opposition leader to put his first question to you. Mr. Opposition Leader?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and good morning to Bermuda and colleagues within Parliament. Premier, my first question to you, considering now that we are beginning to ease regulations on businesses so that they can start reopening construction and the likes, and taking into consideration many employees may be a bit concerned as they return to work, whether conditions are going to be favorable to them and protecting them. Are you looking at any measures of monitoring establishments' compliance to the guidelines that we've set out to ensure that as they reopen, these guidelines are being stuck to, they are being adhered to?
Thank you. Premier, would you like to respond?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In response to the opposition leader, certainly regarding the monitoring of these particular establishments is particularly important. The continuing precautions regulations which enforce allow the Minister of Health to actually close down a business that is not in compliance with any of the guidance which has been issued and posted on the particular website, coronavirus.gov.bn, in combination with the Ministry of Health's officials who regularly do inspections, such as the Department of Environmental Health. In addition, supported by the Ministry of National Security, managed by the Disaster Risk Reduction Mitigation Team, under the leadership of the Minister of National Security. Those, whether they be regiment officers and or police officers, are actually assisting in making sure that the enforcement is being monitored. It is particularly important, as the opposition leader said, that persons heed to this advice, and the easiest and most effective way of this happening is ensuring that every single person in every single establishment where there is working taking place is wearing masks. This has been reiterated by the Minister of Health, and I know that the team from the Ministry of National Security who's assisting in monitoring these particular things, monitoring compliance, is making sure that this is enforced. Additionally, the Ministry of National Security has looked to bring in additional persons to support. I do know that traffic wardens in the city, the Corporation of Hamilton, are also assisting with some of the enforcement measures as well. And I do know that there was a move to get bailiffs to assist in the enforcement measures as well, just to make sure that we are continuing to monitor the establishments which are being put in place. But I would urge businesses to note that if they are caught not following the regulations, they will be closed down, and the government will do that under the abundance of caution to ensure that people are being safe.
Thank you, Premier. Mr. Opposition Leader, would you like to put it to supplementary or
Yes.
another question?
No, supplementary.
Go ahead.
Yes, Premier, taking that into consideration, is there any one particular area, if there are concerns, that you can advise the public that they can call or email to that will speed up the response to ensuring that companies and establishments are compliant? So is there any one particular area, if there is a concern, that they can contact, as opposed to many times what happens is they may contact one of us as MPs or the likes, but is there any one particular area you can identify if they have any concerns that they can contact you or the government?
Premier?
I did one of those mute mistakes. My apologies. I was talking and I was on mute. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My apologies. I thank the opposition leader for his question. I believe there are two particular ways in which persons can report such violations. And the instances where those can be reported are with Bermuda Police Services. They are primarily responsible for type of enforcements, and they will share that particular information with the teams of whom they're working with, as the EMO operational meetings have persons from not only the Ministry of Health, but also the Ministry of National Security, the police, and the regiment. But the members of the public, if there are breaches, are encouraged to call Bermuda Police on 211. They can also go to Bermuda Police website. And just so I can confirm that, I believe that website is, I want to get the wrong one, because I know there is a fake Bermuda Police website, but they can go to the Bermuda Police website, which can be found at police.bm, and then they can go ahead and to report any types of businesses there. There's a form which they can fill out to report items there.
Thank you, Premier. Opposition Leader, would you like to another supplementary or new question?
Yes, another supplementary.
Continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Premier. Considering we've already seen played out in the public one particular establishment complaining about a minister walking into their establishment, is there any advice that you can give to businesses out there as to what they can expect from those who are monitoring, like the Ministry of National Security or the regiment? Is there any protocols that you can give to the establishments out there that they can expect from these officials who might be monitoring as a process that they can expect when they come into an establishment, just to check on them?
I thank the opposition leader for his question. I thank the opposition leader for his question, Mr. Speaker. In most instances, when there are persons who will be uniformed, whether they police or they'll be from the Department of Health, they will have their particular identification, which will be necessary and required, so that persons will know whom they are in that particular case and instance. I think restaurant persons would be familiar with officials from the Department of Environmental Health. Clearly, police and regiment persons are typically uniformed. I believe the case which the opposition leader was referring to was a case in which the Minister of National Security, I would say, on a Sunday went to go look and inspect something for himself. And I am pleased and happy that I have that the country, I think, should be happy that we have a dedicated team of ministers who will go ahead and try to make sure that they are dealing with matters efficiently to protect the safety of the public. So to answer the opposition leader's questions, almost every single enforcement officer I would expect, certainly from health, police, and or the regiment, whether they be bailiffs and or wardens in the city of Hamilton, will be uniformed and should be easily identified.
Thank you, Premier. Opposition leader, would you like to move on to your third supplementary or new question? New question. You only get two supplementaries. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to read that one, Speaker. Okay. Yes,
next question.
Yeah, next question. Premier, taking into consideration, we now have testing done at Southside. There have been reports that they are being told that they would be notified of their results by their doctor. We've also heard from doctors' offices that tests have been done, but they have not been notified, and 4 days have gone by plus, and the doctor's office has not been notified. Is there a particular time frame that those of the public who are getting tested, is there a particular time frame that they can be given that will guide them into an expectation of when those results will be given back to them?
Absolutely. I thank the Honorable Opposition Leader for his question. I do know that the Southside Lab turns around most test results within 24 hours. I do know that they have further developed an automated system in order to make sure they relay those particular answers not only to the doctors, but I believe the Ministry of Health is working on a further revision to actually be able to report negative results directly to patients given the volume of persons that are there. It's important to note that this process itself is self-reporting. So unlike in the other instance of labs, where individuals would have been referred to their doctor through the regular testing phase, this is persons who self-refer themselves. There's instances where doctors' contact information may or may not be correct, information may be relayed, and what my advice to the opposition leader would be, if there's any doctors that are contacting him for those particular questions or challenges, that they direct their information to the Ministry of Health. The Southside Lab does report all information to the Ministry of Health. The Ministry of Health is not the responsible party to relay that information to individuals. The doctors are. But given the fact that we've gone from a process where we're testing about 20 to 30 people a day, which are referred to doctors, to a process where we're testing multiple hundred persons a day, there was definitely a need to the change of process. And the need to the change of process, which I think was agreed, to the best of my recollection, was agreed last week, is a system would be set up whereby negative results could be reported directly to patients and positive results can be reported through their physician.
Supplementary.
Thank you, Premier. Would you like to do your supplementary?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate that. Thank you, Premier. Taking that into consideration, being aware now that there has been some form of a gap in between understanding exactly how the results will be given to those who have been tested at Southside, would you take it upon yourself to ensure that the public is aware? Because there still seems to be some confusion as to whether or not they're supposed to get their doctor then, based on what you have said.
Mr. Speaker, I think that the Minister of Health has reiterated that, but I have no issue reiterating those particular things in public. What I would say is that I do not accept the opposition leader's premise overall that there is a particular gap. What I will say is that this is a challenge, and part of the challenge is that between the fact that people were, in one instance, being referred by doctors, so when they're referred by doctors to the testing which was taking place, administered by the Ministry of Health, the doctors are going to necessarily expect their results. In other cases and instances, when people are self-referring, these are people who may not have doctors, their doctors may change, and they listed old doctors. There's lots of different things that are there. So I don't particularly, as I said, accept the word gap. There are certainly, when we've changed this particular process, there are certainly things that that could have been done better, but I don't think it's a question of the gap. All these results are being reported to the Ministry of Health as required under law. The results are also being sent to the doctors whose contact information were given. There are particular instances and individual stances where people, as I said, either do not have regular doctors, though attendant doctors may have changed, or the contact information would be incorrect. But I am reasonably assured, and I will ask the Minister of Health to reiterate that information out to the doctors' communities, because I do not believe that right now we're experiencing that many problems with that. But I'm happy to take the question of which the opposition leader said under advice. I know the Minister of Health is listening, and I'm certain that we'll be able to send out further guidance to the doctors, and also making sure that the Shadow Minister of Health is inside of that communication so she can be aware of what's going on.
Thank you, Premier. Officer Dean, would you like to put your second supplementary?
Yes, second supplementary. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Premier. If someone is, you mentioned about being tested negative, Premier. If someone is tested positive, can you tell us in the public what one can expect from that to follow from government's involvement? What should that person expect as the next procedures, so people are aware of what they can expect if in the fact that they are positive?
Thank you for that question. I'm going to do my best to answer, as these things typically fall under the ministry of the purview of the Minister of Health, but for the most part, I'm relatively familiar with the process. If that happens, and if there is a positive case, the positive case is reported to the Epidemiology and Surveillance Unit, as it is a reportable act under law. The Epidemiology and Surveillance Unit does not inform the patient. The patient is informed by their primary care physician. So once they're informed by their primary care physician, they will then be contacted by an officer from the Epidemiology and Surveillance Unit to advise to give public health advice. The public health advice, I'm sure, would consist of a number of issues. Number one, certainly the requirement for them to be isolated from other persons, and making sure that they are able to effectively isolate wherever they are. If they're not able to effectively isolate wherever they are, there may be assistance which may be offered for particular isolation to ensure that there's no spread. If they live alone, then they'll be asked their contacts, I assume, at work, and also in the community. If they do not live alone, then the contacts inside of their household will likely be assessed by the Ministry of Health team at the Epidemiology and Surveillance Unit, and will likely be sent for testing on whatever the Epidemiology and Surveillance Unit deems to be the correct procedure. I would say, Mr. Speaker, that as confidential as this particular process is, I actually don't have a view into it. And I thought it was an interesting conversation that the Minister of Health and I were having the other day, where there was comments, and we actually do not know the names and identities of these persons who are positive. And I think that that is keeping with the level of confidentiality which is actually ascribed to this particular process. So I think the Epidemiology and Surveillance Unit does an excellent job of making sure that these things are kept confidential, and they follow the public health guidelines insofar as making sure the person is isolated, their contacts are, they do the contact tracing, their contacts are tested and quarantined. Any contacts certainly would be required to be quarantined, and then follow-up testing would certainly take place.
Thank you, Premier. Officer Needed, that's the your last supplementary on your second question. Would you like to move to a third question?
Third question. Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Premier. In our effort to work together, it was important to get clarity on some things for the public, so I appreciate the answers thus far. My third question, Mr. Speaker, has to do with procurement. Can the Premier explain, taking into consideration, they have, I'm sure, been bombarded, and we've been a part of that process and bombarding the government with opportunities to acquire PPE. We've seen how played out. We're, 1 minute we're getting PPE, the next minute we're not sure when it's actually coming. Or we know that private sector has brought in PPE already, and there have been complications with customs concerning that. Can the Premier explain what really is the procurement process that the government going through to secure PPE? And I ask that question so that people understand that that the government has a fair and equitable process in place.
Thank you for the question. The PPE and procurement is being led under the Public Health Emergency Response team and their Incident Command Center, which has been set up for COVID-19. And so, as far as the procurement and how the procurement is actually happening, is that is being led by Anthony Hunter of BHB and Mr. Dean Paris, who also works at BHB, but who has been seconded over to the Incident Command Center. What I would say is that inside of that particular process, they are making sure that we're placing orders not only for the community, but also for the government. And when it's talking about nursing homes, the hospital, what is needed for emergency services and other services, etc. Our main issue has not necessarily been the procurement of PPE, to be honest, Mr. Speaker. Our main issue has been getting it here. And I think that's been the biggest challenge. So what we've recognized early is that we not only want to use the resources of the government, but we also want to help and use the resource of the private sector. So there are a number of persons who wanted to support this particular process. I'd also reached out to the leader of the opposition for names. Those names were supplied to that team, and that team actually bounces some of the ideas, suggestions, and challenges that they have when it comes to procurement with that particular team of private sector persons to assist. Regarding the fairness of that, what I have now done in the Minister of Finance, I would say more, now that we're out of the emergency phase, a lot of these things are now going through regular procurement. So we've gone from the position of emergency, we need to get these things as quickly as possible. Now we've gone to the position of we have adequate stocks and supplies. We are now looking at restocking for future months and making sure that we are going to then go ahead to put out the various quotes which are necessary and required in order that persons can go ahead and participate in that particular process going forward. I think the process overall right now has been fair, but by and large, most of it has been procured directly from suppliers inside of the People's Republic of China and overseas in massive quantities of bulk. So when we're talking about 400,000 surgical masks, 500,000 N95 masks, masses of face shields, these are very, very, very large quantities which have been done. As we move forward to the resupply, we're going to make sure that we do it under a better framework of, I would say, the procurement process to ensure that the government is getting value for money.
Thank you, Premier. Opposition leader, would you like to put us up your first supplementary?
Yes, first supplementary. Thank you.
Go on.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clarity then, is there a difference between, because you mentioned the hospital, now obviously the hospital is seeking out PPE and government is seeking PPE as well, I'm sure, to ensure that it's essential services, customs and police and the likes and prior. So you're saying that the team that is at the hospital is also handling the procurement for government as well and its needs. Is that what you're saying?
The teams work together. The Bermuda Hospitals Board clearly has sources and trusted sources which they've used for over the years. And so it's not that BHB is buying something and the government's buying something. They're all basically together, and we deal with the accounting issue later about what belongs to BHB and what belongs to the government afterwards. But so far as procurement, we're not doing a separate buying for the hospital, and we're not doing a separate buying for government and government services. They're all part of one order to get the best possible price for these very bulk orders. And it's difficult ordering in small quantities, so it wouldn't make sense. So as I say, when we're talking about these very large things, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of masks that are coming in at once. We've been able to get these things and using a lot of suppliers and also local logistics companies. One thing that the Minister of Health has also informed me is that in addition to buying these things from overseas, we have also done local procurement for smaller issues where there's stocks from the local companies who may have masks and other things which may be in stock here locally.
Mr. Bermuda, would you like to put your second supplementary?
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Speaker, and thank you, Premier. Now that we are testing at a higher level, I'm making the assumption that we are looking long term because we know that the future and today is setting out a new norm on how we walk about publicly, how our establishments, private and public sector, met out their businesses. With all that in mind, are we then forecasting what we're going to need for the future? I think part of that question also is, and I just wanted to ensure that there was a member that I put forward, and that member has not been called at all to be on that team.
I just want to clarify the question I'm answering.
Yeah, forecasting. I was trying to understand about the forecasting. So obviously, there's a new norm for Bermuda, and we're trying to satisfy the immediate need of increased testing for PPE. How are we looking at the future, and is the team establishing a protocol and volumes that we will need in the future, knowing that it's highly likely that we're going to see more and more of this type of incidents happen?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, that's a great question, Leader of the Opposition. And from the perspective of where we are right now, it was getting the stuff that we needed right now. Now we have many months of supplies, and now it's a question of planning for more. And so, especially when it comes to the private sector, persons being open, the actual PPE, which is taken by testing. So because we've ramped up our testing regime, it actually means that a lot more PPE is being used than was being used before, because PPE are gloves, PPE is by all of those, PPE includes all of those particular aspects. So there is more that is being consumed. Those things are being planned out so we can then go ahead and procure more so we have it. Regarding testing, which the opposition leader touched on, the government has sent communication both to the Bermuda Employers Council and to the Chamber of Commerce, reminding them that they can reach out to their employers and member companies to go ahead and book testing to make sure that persons will be tested. And I think that we have enough testing supplies on island right now currently to do 55,000 tests. So there's a significant amount of testing supplies which are on island. We are not short on testing supplies in any way, shape, or form. And so we're going to continue to, as I said, go through this process. And I believe that the testing protocols are being finalized by the Chief Medical Officer. And I'm hoping that we can release those to the public, our entire testing strategy, either next Monday or next Wednesday at the government's press conference.
Thank you, Premier. Opposition Leader, that brings you to the end of your questions. The next member who has a question for you, Premier, is the member from St. George's, Honorable Member Swan. I'd like to put your question.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Question for the Honorable Premier regarding emergency assistance. Premier, what changes have been made to the initial criteria to enable more struggling Bermudians to benefit from the emergency employment insurance safety net?
I thank the honorable member for his question. Certainly, this is a project that we wanted, that was important, and as the Minister of Finance indicated in his particular statement, was important that we got up, and it was emergency. So at the very first instance, it was dealt with those persons who were left unemployed. And as a result of the government's changes, what was realized, of course, with the extent of the closure that there were more persons that found themselves in hard times who may have been small business, who may have been in the informal economy, who may not have been registered with the Office of Tax Commissioner. And in order to be eligible for this assistance, you had to either prove that you worked for an employer that was registered with the Office of Tax Commissioner, or if you were self-employed, had registered with the Office of Tax Commissioner. The fact is that there were some persons in the informal economy who were not. So they may have been hustling, they may have been doing things on their own, they may have been things like personal trainers, working in gyms, and those type of issues, and they did not have access to any form of assistance. What we felt is that this would have been a good opportunity to, number one, get persons compliant and registered with the Office of Tax Commissioner, while also being able to provide them some form of benefit. It is important to note that the government benefit did not require that for small businesses that they had to have no debt with the Office of Tax Commissioner, but they needed to be in good standing. That means on a payment plan, etc. So now these persons who have registered with the Office of Tax Commissioner, who may have been on inside of the informal economy, have now been told to register. Once they register the Office of Tax Commissioner, regularize their details so they can pay payroll tax going forward, they are eligible for a benefit of $300 per week. Additionally, there were some changes that were made in being flexible with certain employers. So there were some larger hotel employers who may have wanted to keep some of their employees on staff or keep paying some of their benefits, but work with the government and not lay them off entirely. So for instance, if an employer wanted to pay a certain portion of a person's salary and give the other part to the government to pay, the government would have saved money overall versus if that employer would have just laid the persons off. The government may have been paying $1 million. In this particular case, the government may just pay $500,000 while working. So there were adjustments that were made, and part of the regulations and amendments that were tabled by the Minister of Finance speak to those modifications and changes, which are important to make sure we're flexible in getting the relief to those persons who need it.
Would you like to do a supplementary?
That was a very comprehensive answer, Mr. Speaker, and covered my supplementary.
Okay, the next member has a question for you. Is Honorable Member Earl Simons. Honorable Member, would you like to put your question to the Premier? Member Simons? Honorable Member? I'll move on to the next person. And the next member on the list is MP Lister. MP, would you like to put your question? I'm moving on. The next name on the list would be that of MP Smith. MP Dan Smith, would you like to put your question?
Yes, good morning, Mr. Speaker. Good morning, colleagues.
Go right ahead and put your question.
Mr. Speaker, as it has been confirmed that a member of the Bermuda Fire Service has tested positive for COVID-19, that member and their family was quarantined and the stations that they worked at was sanitized. Can the Honorable Premier please tell this Honorable House what the protocols are for testing, tracing, and quarantining in light of this positive test?
Thank you. Premier?
Mr. Speaker, I am not sure of the exact protocols of which are followed. I'm happy to make sure that that issue is reverted back to the Shadow Minister of National Security by the Minister of National Security and Ministry of Health. I think I gave a broad overview in an earlier question for the opposition leader, so I don't want to try to take up too much time trying to guess the answer. I would say that there are public health protocols which are followed. It's the things that were identified, the stations were clean, persons who were in close contact may have been quarantined, and their family, the family may have been isolated, and anyone who's tested after that will be isolated, but those persons will be on quarantine. The persons who were not positive would still be on quarantine. So I think that's the best answer I can give, but I'm happy to ask the Minister of Health and the Minister of National Security to revert back to the Honorable Member with that.
Well, members, Premier, thank you for that. Well, members, let's look at our clock. You started Premier's questions at 11:19 for 30 minutes. It's now 11:49, which brings us to a close of the Premier's question. And we'll now move on to the normal question period, which is for an hour starting now. And it is the start at 11:50. The questions this morning are in reference to the statements. Premier, the first questions this morning to you from the opposition leader. Opposition leader, would you like to put your question now to the Premier in reference to his statement this morning? Morning. Officer Slater,
Yes.
would you like to put your question to the Premier this morning regarding his statement?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just as a point of clarification, unfortunately, Cole's mic was blocked and he wasn't able to release it. So just giving you a heads up if we can check on that. I know we're going to have some complications as we go forward.
Okay.
Yeah. So moving on to on page 4, the Premier mentions where he talks about seeking out the supporting public health and they're providing advice. And I'm assuming he's talking about the health department. The question I have for him then is, what other organizations in the private health sector has the Premier and his cabinet sought advice from to help them develop and support their decision making?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In regards to other persons in the private sector, I can't speak to that. I'm certain that the Ministry of Health and the Chief Medical Officer may seek advice. I know that the Chief Medical Officer has a public health emergency response team, which includes some members of the private sector as a part of that. And I'm sure that in her ongoing communication with physicians and her meetings that she has with physicians, they certainly give and would provide feedback which we felt through the Minister of Health. But from a cabinet's perspective and consideration, we take in our decision making, we take advice from we take advice from the Minister of Health, who gets her advice from her ministries. We also have a public health advisory panel, which advises me directly, but those are all made up of persons who are public officers and also who work for the Bermuda Hospitals Board, with the exception of the Government Science Advisor, Dr. Creek Weldon, also sits on that particular one.
Thank you, Premier. Officer Lindley, would you like a supplementary?
No, thank you. That's okay.
Second question? No? Okay. The next member who has a question for you in your statement this morning is Member Dunkley. And remember, would you like to put your question?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. No, my question was during Premier question period, not for the statement.
Okay, no. Thank you.
But I do have questions for Deputy Premier and the Finance Minister.
Yes, I do have you listed here. Okay. The next person who has a question for the Premier then is the Deputy Chairman. Would you like to put your question?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honorable Premier, in your statement this morning, you respectfully seem to try to have it both ways about whether or not the government is obliged to table regulations in the House of Assembly. You said you weren't obliged, but you would do so anyway. I'm not going to get into the law, but would you agree that regulations issued by the government must be tabled in the House of Assembly for parliamentary scrutiny?
Here's what I'll say. I will certainly agree with the honorable member's question that regulations made by the government must be tabled in the House of Assembly, and that is clear under the Statutory Instruments Act by any type of regulation which is made. At issue here, and I will concede without question that it is certainly an arguable point, and they say if you get any number of lawyers in the room, you'll get any number of different questions, thoughts, or opinions. I act on the basis of the advice of which I'm given, and I gave the outline for the advice of which I'm given. So the fact is that when the Statutory Instruments Act was introduced, there was 30 pages of consequential amendments which were made by that particular act. And it was noted that other provisions similar to Section 6 of the Emergency Powers Act, which of course preceded our existing Constitution, were converted to a negative resolution procedure, which provided both parliamentary scrutiny and publication. It was not done for this particular act for whatever reason. And the fact is that this act itself is not, as is stated, is not subject to parliamentary scrutiny. There is a process which is laid out in the Emergency Powers Act regarding the regulations being tabled, but the question as to whether or not they're subject to parliamentary scrutiny is an outstanding and arguable question. What I would say, however, Mr. Speaker, is that we are going to make the amendments and the changes which were done, so there could be no further debate on it. But I will accept with the honorable member that it is certainly an arguable point, and though I am not a lawyer, I am certain that lawyers will find a way of rounding issues to basically have it two ways. But it is a difficult subject, but I will say this, that regulations which are issued by the government, not the governor, the government, under things of law, are all applicable to the Statutory Instruments Act and are all required to be tabled for parliamentary scrutiny. Going forward, anything which is issued under the Emergency Powers Act, after the amendments in which the House and the Senate will be invited to make, will then be subject to that exact same procedure, so there is no ambiguity whatsoever.
Thank you, Premier. Would you like a supplementary?
Supplementary, please.
Yes.
Honorable Premier, I'm grateful for the clarification that all government regulations will now be tabled in the House as they should have been. In terms of your answer on the Emergency Powers Act, Section 6 clearly states that regulations issued under emergency powers must be laid before the legislature. There is no doubt or scope for argument. And would you agree that it is proper to have open democracy and lay emergency power regulations before Parliament for parliamentary scrutiny?
I would absolutely agree that is the case, and that is the reason why not only things being laid, but we are amending the law to make sure there is no ambiguity. However, in the instance in which you said that in Section 6 of the Emergency Powers Act, as I have stated, that I had acted on the basis of the advice received, and it is without question an arguable point. So it is arguable either way. I'm not going to get into the debate. It is something that could be argued either way. You say Emergency Powers Act 1963, inside of my statement it says the Statutory Powers Act may supersede it. There's ambiguity inside of it. We have, as I said, we have gone past that. We are basically saying the governor has inserted provisions inside of these new regulations that the House of Assembly will have to give a message to see if they want them extended. The governor has put that provision inside of there. We are now making sure that we're going to amend the actual Statutory Instruments Act and the Emergency Powers Act, so there is no ambiguity going forward. So I would say that it is an arguable point, but the advice of which I was given, and which is the basis on which I must act, on the basis of legal advice in which I'm given, is that.
Before I ask if Madam would you like to put this next question or supplementary, let me just intercede here and speak and indicate that when the Parliament was called to address, to sit under those emergency measures, it was indicated there to the government that at a regular sitting, the first regular sitting, we would expect all the regulations to be done. We sat under the emergency situation so that they could be gazetted, which required at the time, so that they could get enacted. They had to be gazetted. So the emergency sittings were allowed that process to take place, and it was then indicated in the process that I expected whenever we had our first regular sitting of business, that the regulations would be tabled before Parliament, which I had expressed to privately when a question and asked by the opposition leader. So I just wanted to make that clear that nothing untoward was done in that regard, in the opinion of the Speaker, because the Speaker understood the process was shared with both sides. Mr. Chairman, would you like to put a supplementary?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On your question.
No, just a supplementary and final supplementary. Honorable Premier, I'm grateful. What I've understood you to say is that on a going forward basis, regulations will now be tabled in Parliament for democratic scrutiny.
And in response to that, Mr. Speaker, if I may, regulations that are subject to the Statutory Instruments Act, which is any regulation made by the government, is always tabled and is always structured and always subject to parliamentary scrutiny. There is a difference between regulations made by the government and regulations made by the governor. The regulations made by the governor, it is arguable as to whether or not they were subject to parliamentary scrutiny. As I have indicated that there are lawyers who can argue both sides of the particular issue, I acted on the basis of the advice of which I received, which is the only way that the Premier can act when it comes to legal matters in these particular issues. And we are amending the rules to make sure that any regulations which are issued under emergency powers will be subject to parliamentary scrutiny. So I just want to make that incredibly clear. There has never been an issue as to whether or not instances by the government are subject to parliamentary scrutiny. There are issues of things where done by the governor in this particular issue. And I just want to make sure that we are separating the two particular instances. And in any particular case and instance where out of the numerous negative resolution things which are done, if there is something which may have been missed, I'm happy for the honorable member to inform us, and I'm happy to ask for the public service to go ahead and look to make sure that all negative resolution things have necessarily been tabled in the House.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, you indicated you had no more questions? That brings us to a close of the questions, or members who indicated they had questions for the Premier. The next statement this morning that members have indicated have a question is that for the Deputy Premier.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
It's MP Trevor Myers. I indicated I had a question and a point of order on the Premier's statement.
Okay, I thought your question was under the Premier's question period.
No, on his statement,
Hey, I'm just going back up here. Yes, you did indicate it. I took it as being part of the question period because your name was on the original list for the previous questions too. I just thought you were reconfirming what the whip had said.
Yes.
Okay. Put your question.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I prefer to take it as a point of order. I couldn't take it as point of order at the time because we didn't have copies of the statements to refer to. We now have them. They've been put on the website. So my point of order is that the Premier was misleading the House in his statement.
Okay.
Particularly, some of what I'm going to say, Mr. Speaker, will be repeating some of what the Shadow Attorney General MP Pittman was saying. But the paragraph at the bottom of page 1 and the parts on page 2, which refer precisely to this issue of tabling. I believe that he was misleading the House in his statement. The situation, you, Mr. Speaker, you're aware of my concern because I'd written you an email on the 18th of April, which you responded to on the 21st of April, and it was part of it was precisely on this subject of the necessity to table regulations.
And I indicate, and Mr. Modest, just as I interjected just now, I indicated to your questioning, your query, and the opposition leader's query that at the regular sitting, the first regular sitting, the government will be tabling the regulations, which is what today is.
Right, but my concern is this, Mr. Speaker. What the legislation, whether it's the Statutory Instruments Act of 1977 or whether it's the Emergency Powers Act of 1963, there's a requirement to table as soon as reasonably practicable, which is as soon as possible. The difficulty here, and we have it here with these regulations, is you may have regulations, these are emergency regulations, which are suspending individuals' rights under the Constitution of freedom of movement, etc. And so you may have a regulation which comes into force, which is only going to be enforced for maybe 2 weeks. And that's why it says in the provision in my submission that it has to be raised as soon as practicable, because if it's the next regular sitting of the House, the regulations may have gone by that time. So there'd be no point to wait for a regular sitting. And to my mind, this is no more regular sitting than our 2 previous sittings. We're still meeting virtually. We're not meeting as we should be meeting. They need to be raised as soon as possible. And we make this for future reference. We don't want to flog the Premier too much for his mistake, but we just want to say when you have these sort of emergency regulations, they should be raised as soon as possible, and that it was necessary to do so under either act. It's lucidly clear. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Before the Premier response, let me just clarify one point. This is a regular sitting. The day was scheduled when we closed the House at the recess in March, that we would sit again on the 8th of May. This is that scheduled meeting. We may be using a different form in which we're meeting, but it is the regular sitting day of business that was scheduled in our calendar to sit on. The other 2 meetings that took place in the meantime were not scheduled regular meetings. Continue, Premier, you can answer your question.
Mr. Speaker, just in defense of your staff, I would just like to point out that I've been made aware that the statements were on the website before they were read. So that's in defense of your very hardworking staff that has had to adjust to this virtual sitting very quickly. On the second issue, Mr. Speaker, I have no intention of beating this dead horse any further. There will be disagreements between the former Attorney General and myself on a multitude of particular issues. As I had stated, I acted on the basis of the advice of which I had received. The fact is, it will be clear and unambiguous going forward that these items will be tabled. But I want to make sure that it is also clear for everyone who is listening and also for honorable members that the last time of which the House did meet, the House did move and vote by affirmative resolution, as did the Senate, to extend the emergency powers, making the state of emergency in the country until the end of June. We have to be flexible. These items will change. When we're going to go over the take note motion this evening, there is going to be additional changes of which have been come to us, which will be discussed as well. And I'm going to be happy to take the feedback of honorable members. But the fact is that we have to recognize that we do have a cabinet-style government, and just because the House Assembly is not sitting does not mean that the cabinet cannot go ahead and, in consultation in this particular case with members of the opposition, make changes to the regulations in which they exist. We have tried in our best to act in a bipartisan fashion. In this particular case and instance, this was something the opposition leader and I did discuss last week. We are going to move forward in a period of bipartisanship. And as challenging as it may be for some of us to adjust to this, I believe that it is working quite well. So we will make the changes, and I will hope that we will move past this particular situation. I acted on the basis of the advice which I received. It is arguable. There are persons who look at it and say it can go either way. We're going to make it clear and unambiguous. But so we are clear also, Mr. Speaker, there was no requirement in law, and this is clear, there was no requirement in law for the emergency powers regulations to be published and or gazetted. And we made sure that we published and gazetted them. They were not something that was done in secret. They were something that were posted for every single person in the country to know.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. The Honorable Premier is misleading the House. The debate is not about whether or not there was a legal obligation to gazette them. The debate we're having this morning is about whether there was a legal obligation flowing from the Constitution to table them in the House of Parliament. And that is the matter about which the Premier is being criticized.
Mr. Speaker, if I may, I did not realize we were having debates. I thought we were answering questions, and I provided the answer to the question. The answer to the question is very particular, clear in this particular instance. So while the shadow AG and the former shadow AG may wish to debate, I'm not going to debate the matter. We've laid out the statements, and we are going to amend the law so we don't have to debate this in the future.
Thank you, Premier. We'll move on to the next question. Now, Mr. Moniz, you were completed with your questions?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The next statement that members would like to put a question to is the statement from the Deputy Premier. Deputy Premier, you have a question from the MP Dunkley. MP Dunkley, would you like to put your question?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good afternoon to colleagues in the listening audience. In the statement by the Honorable Deputy Premier in regards to the solar farm and progress, at the end of the statement, the Deputy Premier says on the 6th page that, and I quote, "What this means is that all ratepayers will benefit from this power." It goes on to say the solar farm will lower our energy costs and also improve our environment. Question to the Honorable Member: how much lower will energy costs be, and when will that benefit be felt by consumers?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. In answer to the Honorable Member's question, the exact precise amount is not determined yet. That power will flow to as a result of a power purchase arrangement will be provided to Ascendant, Belco, and they will use it as power to supplement the peak load. How much that exact amount is, as I said in my statement, is not quite clear yet. It will be determined once that process resumes, or once that process starts, and then we'll be able to evaluate what the savings will be. But it'll be a very small incremental impact on a number of households as a result of the power that will come from the solar array will allow for Belco to not have to put on its very costly diesel engines, which when fuel is burned on those engines does have a real impact on the cost of bills.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary, new question. Supplementary?
Supplementary. Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, I appreciate the attempt at providing the answer, Mr. Speaker. It's quite clear that when any solar panels are put up, there is an ability to estimate the power generated and the cost savings. I've done it myself a couple of years ago when I had solar panels installed on my house. So can the Honorable Deputy Premier please provide an estimate then of the savings that will be passed on to the consumer?
I think the honorable member is comparing a utility scale array which has yet to actually be turned on. And as I said in the statement, a lot of this will depend on the amount of hours of sunlight and how much power is actually stored and then used. Since that has not started yet, I cannot give a estimate in the way that he's asking the question. And his original question was the estimate of saving. But I don't think you can compare a utility scale operation to a household operation in this actual instance. Although I will work to get an answer for the honorable member and the House as I discuss the matter with Belco and with the persons operating the utility. So I'll endeavor to get a estimate to him and the House at the earliest opportunity.
Thank you, Deputy. Mr. Member, do you have a further question?
Mr. Speaker.
Yes, supplementary? Madam Whip, would you, Opposition Whip, you have a supplementary?
If Member Duncan is Packwood and Pamplin.
Okay, yes.
Entry question on the minister's response.
Mr. Speaker?
Yes.
Yes. So my question is to the government's communications statement this morning. I'm just wondering what security criteria has been put in place to protect the social media channels from fraud and any other kinds of attacks or threats through our communication, so that we make sure that our communication is genuinely coming from government and is not fraudulent or copycat messaging.
Hello?
Madam Whip?
Yes.
Can you restate your question for me?
Yes, this is regarding the communications ministerial statement. I'm just curious.
No, you jumped ahead. You jumped ahead. We're still on the Deputy Premier's solar statement.
No, I did not have a question on that one. I'm on the
You come in, I thought you were seeking a supplementary on the solar statement. So
no.
Let's go back to, you were still on that statement. MP Dunkley had a question. He had his question. He had a supplementary. I was asking, do you have a second supplementary, MP Dunkley, or are we going to move on from that statement?
I have a further question, Mr. Speaker, but I understand my colleague might have a question, supplementary, my first question, the Honourable Member Packwood and Pamplin, and I will move it back for her and then come back.
Sure. MP Pamplin, do you have a supplementary on that solar statement?
I do, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, we'll take your supplementary now.
Thank you. My supplementary, the Deputy Premier spoke in terms of the relationship and the passing forward of the additional energy to the grid, and he specified ascendant. And my question is that any indication that there's going to not likely to be any movement to their proposed sale, or are we just saying ascendant or anybody else who stands in that stead?
nothing in my statement pertains to the sale or the proposed sale of that company. Ascendant is the principal holding company for Belco, so they are the same. And right now, it is a locally owned company, and it's and the arrangement between the provider of the power at the array and the utility are that will not change at this juncture at all. And whatever changes happens will be a matter for the regulatory authority, not for the government.
Okay, I just, maybe if I
Would you like to put a second supplementary to it?
yeah, maybe a second supplementary.
Yes.
I might clarify what
Would you second supplementary?
And the second supplementary is that given that Ascendant is the present structure, and the minister indicated that the flow of energy would come from the solar farm to the excuse me, to Ascendant, which he said by name. My question that I was attempting to get at is, does the Deputy Premier mean that it would be the Ascendant or any other company that stands in that stead in the event of a sale? I know he didn't mention sale in his statement, but I'm just trying to find out. He specified Ascendant, and I'm just getting questions from people indicating he's saying Ascendant. What does Ascendant mean? Does that mean that there's no movement? So that was the reason I was trying to get clarity if the Deputy Premier could say that he is speaking of whoever stands in the stead of that company as we know it.
Yes.
That satisfies me.
Okay. Andrew Dunkley, would you like to put your second question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate the commitment by the Deputy Premier to get back on the previous question. Second question then, can the Honorable Deputy Premier please provide the latest cost estimate for the entire project to government or to any government quango?
Certainly I can give that information. I do have some information as I have received on the original question of Mr. Dunkley. And as to a number, it's not particularly high, but about $4 a year for every ratepayer over the next 20 years is likely to be the savings that he questioned. But what it does is stabilize a small portion of the electricity that will be produced without any storage being a part of that system. So around $4 a year for every ratepayer for the next 20 years is likely to be the impact once the solar array begins to provide that electricity to the utility. As it relates to the overall cost of the solar development, it's somewhere between $20 to $23 million is the full cost of the deployment of the development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a supplementary then. I appreciate
supplementary, yes.
I appreciate the answer on the estimate of $4 a year for every ratepayer over 20 years.
So years.
Over 20 years.
Yes.
So I'm assuming then that the life expectancy of the project is 20 years then.
Yes, I believe that the contract and existing arrangement is for a design, finance, build, maintain, and decommission of that array after a 20-year period, 20 to 25 years. It may be 25 years, but I'll confirm the exact date, but it certainly is somewhere between 20 and 25 years is the contracted commission arrangement for that array.
Final supplementary then, Mr. Speaker?
Yes, do you have a supplementary? Second supplementary?
Final supplementary on this. So
yes.
based on that the Deputy Premier said $4 a year for every ratepayer for 20 years, and the total cost of the project is $20 to $23 million. That I'm assuming then that there are no other costs that will be imposed on the Bermuda government or the taxpayer going forward.
No, there isn't any cost. I mean, this array was totally built and financed by the developer. The only costs that the government would have incurred are related to the preparation of the site, as the government is the landlord of the land. So the government would have incurred costs for the preparation of the site as the landlord, like any landlord relationship. If it's your house, you prepare the house so that your tenant can occupy it. So that's what
So the 20 to 23 million you provided with a margin for error of 3 million in there, does that include the site preparation?
No, it does not. That includes the cost for the developer to deploy the actual array and all the work that they had to do. I can get information precisely on how much the government might have expended on its preparation of the site, as was a commitment within the tenant agreement, the landlord agreement. So I can get that information as well, what the precise number is. But the 20 or so million dollars was the cost of the investment, because that was totally the investment of the developer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would appreciate the undertaking by the Deputy Premier to come back with the total cost of the project, with all of this being put in there, because we're talking about money, and estimates are good, but I like to see.
I think he's given an undertaking. He's given an undertaking. I appreciate his undertaking.
I can assure, Mr. Speaker, I can assure the honorable member that, the lion's share, certainly a high percentage, if not most of that 20 million estimate figure, that was the cost of the developer. The only cost that would have been incurred by the government would be relation to its obligations as the landlord, which were stipulated in the lease agreement between the Bermuda government and the actual developer, as we are the landlord for the land. And just to be clear, the government still owns the land that the array is on. That land was not sold.
Thank you, Deputy.
I wait for the feedback, sir.
Yeah, Deputy, that was the only question for you. We'll now move on to the next statement. The next statement is from Minister of Finance. Minister of Finance, your statement in reference to COVID-19. There are questions for you in regard to that. And the first question would be from the opposition leader. Remember, would you like to put your question to the minister?
Yes. Can you hear me, Speaker?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister Dixon, on page, I believe it's page 4, you mentioned about small to medium-sized enterprises, businesses, and you referenced about the grants and the loans. And I must say, I've heard some feedback from those who have applied in the positive. One of the concerns that was brought forward was understanding the time frame through which the application is made, accepted, that a grant and or loan or both are given. Is there a realistic time frame that the public has been given that they can expect to receive those funds within their bank account? Are you aware of a time frame so that people can realistically have an expectation?
Thank you. Minister?
Speaker, I want to thank the opposition leader for that question. Opposition leader, the Ministry of Finance is responsible for the funding provided to the BEDC. The administration and operation of the grants and loans is within the remit of the BEDC. I can undertake to reach out to the BEDC, or my team do that, and get an answer for you on the time frame with respect to the granting of approvals and the subsequent disbursement of grant or loan proceeds.
So opposition leader, supplementary or further question?
Supplementary, yeah. If the finance minister could find out exactly what that is. The reason I'm asking the questions in the format that I am is really to be informative to the public. For whatever reasons, maybe they're not able to get a hold of a minister or someone at BDC or the likes, and they ask questions of us. So we're all on the same page. If he could take it upon himself to get that answer, it would be great, and then we can make it public, and I can support the positive initiative that's been taken on.
Thank you. No further question?
Mr. Speaker, as a point of order, if I may.
Yes.
Just pursuant to Standing Order 17.9, I'm asking if you allow me to possibly give an immediate answer to the Leader of the Opposition.
Oh, okay.
Yes, the standing orders will allow someone to be able, the other minister, be able to assist.
If I could just say, I think that all the honorable opposition leaders' questions will be on the website, on the BEDC website. They have a lot of things that are outlined on there, but their time to return and for approval is within 2 weeks' time. So that's the approval timelines of which they've set out.
Appreciate it.
Mr. Leader, you got that?
I got it. Thank you. Much appreciated.
Any further supplementary question?
I thought it was more of a point of clarification as opposed to point of order.
Okay. All right. There are other members who would like to put questions to you, Minister, in reference to that statement. The next member is the Honorable Member Chancellor. Honorable Member, would you like to put your question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister on page 5 indicates that they met with CARTAC, been working with CARTAC, who has revised the growth forecast from a positive 1 to 2 to a negative 7.5 to 12.5. My question to the Minister is, has CARTAC in those deliberations provided any observations or recommendations that might assist us in mitigating those negative projections?
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I think the statement read that we had worked with CARTAC, and on the basis of those inputs from CARTAC, we had made some adjustments to our own projections based on consultation with CARTAC. From what I'm aware of, the CARTAC did not offer any recommendations on how we could stem the rate of decline. The rate of decline is actually going to be a function of the actual activities that happen. Rate of decline that actually was experienced in Bermuda. Speaker, can you ask whoever's mic is unmuted to please mute it?
Somebody's mic is giving us a feedback. It looks like from this end. Oh,
Madam President.
Yeah, I got you. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the actual experience that would inform the projections for Bermuda would be a function of what we had observed on the ground. So there were not any suggestions from CARTAC provided with respect to how we might mitigate the extent of the decline.
Okay.
Thank you for that response. I have no
no supplementary?
No supplementary. I have
second question? Okay. What's the second question?
Okay. On page 6 of the state.
Speaker, Madam President's mic is live again, please.
It's not on.
It's showing live. Okay, now I don't know. Okay, we're good. We're good now, Madam President. Okay, in setting the $2.9 billion debt ceiling, which we did just before Parliament closed for the break, notwithstanding our best efforts, is that ceiling deemed to be realistic given the stresses that we now are showing that have become evident as the demands on the public purse are manifesting themselves?
Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My response to the honourable member would be that the setting of the ceiling is more of an art than it is a science. I would say this, that I have in my own mind a feeling around what I think the ultimate number is from a debt ceiling perspective before there may be a potential action by the rating agencies. In my mind, I think that number is $3 billion. Now, I do accept that as a result of the pandemic, the circumstances for a number of governments have changed. And I do believe that there may be some consideration by rating agencies given to the times in which we're living. So there may be some scope for a number higher than $3 billion. Having said that, I think it's important for us to exercise a degree of discipline. The topic of the debt has been, the honorable member will appreciate much more than I will, front and center in this chamber for the better part of many years. And so in an effort to remain focused on the issues that are attendant with high debt numbers and the potential impact on the economy, the guidance that I gave then was my best thinking. And I've used that best thinking in trying to inform the development of strategies around how we move forward in light of the pandemic. The estimates that I've presented in the statement this morning are at best guesses based on information that we currently have available. These numbers may need to be refined as a result of the experience that we have over the course of the next 9 to 10 months. Ideally, the 175 number that we have that I've mentioned today is a number that is reasonable and that gives consideration to all the work that needs to be done, while at the same time recognizing that the notion that we can continue to borrow without having to give consideration that we pay it back is not a strategy that will lead to the long-term sustainability of Bermuda.
Okay, thank you.
And supplementary, another question?
I have a third question.
Third question? Yes, what's the last question?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, having expressed our concern that the 2021 budget was obsolete before we passed it back in February, March, the Minister on page 7 of his statement speaks to 4 areas of savings that have been identified that's delayed for additional 6 months start in the freeze of funding vacant posts, continuing the non-essential government travel, and reducing all spending, including whatever. My question is, he has indicated that he's looking at those 4 areas in the main that will provide $50 to $60 million worth of savings. Could the minister give us some kind of indication as to a program by program? He's got these 4 bullet points. What of those bullet points has identified to make up the majority of the $50 to $60 million savings that indicated? And maybe I can just expand that a little if I'm speaker. That's given the fact that earlier in his statement he's indicated that he's already had indications for $70 to $80 million that is required for different programs that have been identified to him. 20 million for health, national security, legal affairs, and the like. 44 on unemployment. 12 to BEDC, and for estimates, with an additional 80 plus $1 million. So I'm just now asking, does he know what of that knowledge would be allocated to those 4 areas to which he's referred in his statement?
Thank you, Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I would rather speak in generalities as opposed to specifics because these are preliminary estimates as we are working to kind of find ways to ensure that we do not exceed the $175 million deficit number that I mentioned earlier in my statement. What I would say is that the lion's share of any potential savings related to those 4 items are generated from salaries and wages associated with unfilled or vacant funded positions. So there's people cost. There are other costs associated with training and travel, which in the main may not be a whole bunch of dollars, but in going through this exercise in terms of trying to find ways to save money, everything needs to be on the table. On the capital expenditure side, I think colleagues will remember that in the budget debate, we talked about the $20 million of deficit for 2021 was principally associated with funding capital expenditures. We're actually also looking at capital expenditures as a way of trying to save some money and looking at potentially $10 million of savings there, although we haven't really dug really deep yet, but we're still continuing to do so. But the bulk of the savings will come from freezing or not hiring people for posts that have been funded but remain vacant today.
Okay. Thank you. Any further questions I have on this particular issue, I will take offline with the minister.
Thank you. Thank you, honourable member. Minister, there is one other member who wishes to put a question in reference to your statement. That's from the honourable member Dunkley. Andrew Dunkley, what's your question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on page 3 of the Honorable Minister's statement, he discusses the introduction of the unemployment benefit. A question to the Honorable Minister: what mechanism is in place for people to notify that they are being rehired and thus are coming off the unemployment benefit? I've had a couple of individuals who have expressed concern that they can't notify that they are now coming off and being rehired. So what advice can the minister give?
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for that question. Just to provide some perspective, the policy for this program was developed in, I think, a matter of 6 or 7 short hours. Members will remember this morning I introduced a number of, a motion to introduce a number of forms of the unemployment benefit because we've made some subsequent changes to the program, the regulations, as we went about affecting it over the course of the last 6 weeks. I can tell you that the capability for employees to notify the Department of Workforce Development of their return to work is actually being built into the application as we speak. In an effort to get the program up and running quickly, the functionality for employees being able to notify the Department of Workforce Development was not initially built into the application. That capability is now being built.
Just a supplementary question?
Yes, a supplementary, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the answer, but people going back to work this week, then by the answer that the Honourable Minister just gave, could actually also receive the unemployment benefit at the same time. So how can we alleviate that challenge so the money can be pushed to somebody who actually needs the benefit because they're not working?
Minister?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would say this to the honourable member. The next payment cycle for those who have received benefits up through this point is for next week. The data run for determining the payments for next week will be concluding on next week, Tuesday. So in as much as there are folks who want to alert the Department of Workforce Development of their return to work, they can do so either through a telephone call or an email to the Department of Workforce Development. I would tell the honourable member that to some degree there is an expectation that people will be honourable in making requests and making themselves taking advantage of the government unemployment benefit, and taking advantage is not used as a pejorative in this case. And so there is an expectation that people will do the right thing. I would like for folks to understand that the government is borrowing every single penny that it is expended on this benefit for the benefit of those persons who needed the support. It would be unfortunate if there were persons who are taking advantage of this benefit as a result of a lag in getting the application up and running and not kind of fulfilling their moral obligation to do the right thing. I know that the team has been working really hard on this. I will get a briefing in fairly short order around how far along we are. But my expectation is that the capability, the feature that will allow people to notify DWD of their return to work should be operational, if not today, by Monday of next week.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary?
I have another question, but before I come to that, I will take it offline. I will take it offline to the minister. But let me be clear. I'm not in any way saying that an employee is taking advantage of the benefit when they go back to work. What I'm saying is I know of employees who are trying to get off the benefit because they're back to work. But I'll take it offline so we can save the government money and put it to use to people who need it.
Thank you.
Next question, Mr. Speaker.
This last one before.
You have a supplementary on that? Is that MP Pamphlet?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
What's your supplementary?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Briefly, the minister has just indicated in his response to MP Dunkley that the government is borrowing money in order to meet this this benefit that it's offering for this emergency employment. My question is the minister saying that we are actually drawing down on facilities that we had arranged, or did we not have sufficient cash flow thus far that would have come in from the April 15th taxation money that would preclude him from having to draw down on the facility?
Mr. Speaker, I would say this, that the phrasing, borrowing the money was a turn of a phrase. When I look at our numbers, I look at the full year impact and of my cash flows. As it sits now, we are in a cash positive position. There was a period of time when these benefits were being paid, which extends back to early April before the full receipts from the April collections were actually received, where we had the flexibility to tap into a line of credit should we needed it. I'm happy to report that tax receipts received in April were actually good, and we hadn't had to draw down on those facilities. But in looking forward, with respect to kind of anticipated expenditure, even with contemplated reductions in revenues and expenditure, I'm forecasting that the government will need to borrow money.
Thank you.
In response to Speaker, just one, if your indulgence, because I know people are listening. For those folks who have returned to work and would like to notify the Department of Workforce Development, you can do so by email to unemploymentbenefit@gov.bm. You should include your name, your social insurance number, and your date of birth, and a date to which you return back to work.
Thank you, Minister. MP Dunkley, did you finish your questions? So that was a supplementary from.
Second question, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to the Honorable Minister, on the same page 3, the Honorable Minister refers to the increased emergency funding. And one of the items he lists is $2.8 million to the Ministry of Health. Can the Honorable Minister please provide a breakdown of the expenditure in that $2.8 million to each vendor, what items were purchased, and at what cost?
Mr. Speaker, I can undertake to provide the honorable member with those details. Can I do that offline? I don't have those numbers at the ready at my home.
Thank you. Dunkley, are you okay with that? The minister
most certainly. Most certainly. And what I will do is I'll send the minister an email just so he has the information, because he's in the middle of this as well. So final question, Mr. Speaker.
Final question, yes.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, on the page 8 of the minister's statement, the honorable minister talks about fruitful discussions with the union partners of the Bermuda government. So a question to the honorable minister. The honorable minister does not talk about any positive potential outcomes of those discussions. So the question to the minister is, when will any decision be made on any salary reductions, temporary or otherwise, for members of parliament or any of our valued civil servants be made?
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order?
Yeah, this is just giving us a reminder that it is gone past 12:30.
We've got that all sorted out.
Okay, no problem.
We're going to do this after the question period ends.
No problem.
Okay. We'll finish the questions and we'll get there. Minister, would you like to respond to the question from MP Duncan?
Mr. Speaker, our conversation with the unions, this was last week, it was an introductory conversation where the government had the opportunity to set out the state of play with respect to the government's finances and our own view on where things stood and where things were going to go. The point of the conversation was to be transparent with the unions with respect to kind of our views on where we thought things were going and to identify opportunities for potential cost savings. We did not at that meeting ask the unions to quantify an amount of concessions for us. What we did is we asked them to go away after having had an opportunity to hear from us around the state of play to reflect on potential opportunities. My understanding is that folks will be meeting over the course of this week and next week with a view towards getting back to us with their ideas around potential ways that we can work together to narrow the gap with respect to the deficit. And I with respect to kind of pay cuts for civil servants and for members of parliament, let's park the civil servants to the side for a moment because that will come out of the process, the discussions with the unions. I have said publicly, I think it was last week Saturday, that it is my expectation that members of parliament and the members of the Senate will step up to the plate, similar to the concessions that are being undertaken or given by the public officers.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Dunkley, are you comfortable with that? No further question or supplementary?
I have a further question, but I'll take it offline in the essence of giving somebody else an opportunity.
Thank you. That brings us to end on the questions for that particular statement. The next statement that members have a question for is actually a statement to Minister Simmons. Minister Simmons is a member would like to put a question in reference to your statement on the public communications for COVID-19, and that's from the opposition whip. Honourable member, would you like to put your question now?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, so my question is, with all of the government media channels in the social media domain, all the social media channels that have been activated, what security has been put in place to make sure that there's very low or no risk to any fraudulent behavior, any impersonations of the premier, etc.?
Thank the honorable member for that question. There's a couple of things in place. At the beginning of this year, we began the process of verifying all of the government's social media accounts. It's taken a lot longer than we would have hoped, but our government Facebook page should be validated within the month, which was part of our process to be able to launch the government WhatsApp system, working through the company Facebook, which owns WhatsApp as well. Our social media monitors, led by Courtney Bushner and Carlita Lodge, basically on a daily basis identify any fake accounts and report them immediately, as well as we send out notifications, and you might have seen one about a week or so ago in relation to the premier cloned premier's account. The part of the thing that I think that we have stressed, it is very important in this age of social media for Bermudians and people in general to be vigilant, because there are people who will seek to use this time to spread misinformation, whether it's voice notes of people claiming to be in the know, whether it is false WhatsApp messages and things of that nature. Now, what our team has been doing is we catch them as early as we can, and we begin to push back out to refute them, whether it's the premier doing a voice note, whether it's posts on social media, whether it's addressed at press conferences. It is an issue, I think, that really goes back to us on our end getting the accounts fully verified as they should be, and also goes into us being responsive and adaptive and keeping track of false information and false accounts and addressing them as soon as they pop up. But there's a component of the public being aware. And there's a number to contact and an email to contact if you have a false account. I will get my team to publicize it. I don't have it at my fingertips. But also, it is important to note we ran a campaign earlier, late last year, in reference to no member of parliament or government official will ever ask you for money online, and public needs to be aware of that. No public official, OBA, PLP, or Green Split P, will ask you for money online. If that occurs, there is a contact number through the police to report it. And as I said, we'll endeavor to publicize those numbers so that the public are wrapped in and become a part of this. And I encourage the honorable member to reach out to me if she has any further suggestions relating to security. I'd welcome them as well.
Thank you, Minister. Any supplementary or further questions, Madam? Opposition Whip? Opposition Whip?
I have nothing else. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, that actually brings us to the end of both the time. The time just ran out. It's now 12:50. It started at 11:50. That was the last statement that that was a question for. I'm going to call on the Premier and ask the Premier if he'll give us a customary break. At this time, let me say, members, that we did extend into past the normal break time of 12:30. It's now just about 1 o'clock, and we're going to take a break from 1 to 2. I know most of you or some of you may be in comforts of other areas, but I have to be mindful of the fact that I am in chamber with staff, and it looks like we're going to be in for a long day. I think it's only due that they do get a break for a few minutes only, and we'll be back at 2 o'clock if the Premier now wishes to acknowledge us for lunch. Premier?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that this honorable House do now adjourn until 2 p.m. for lunch.
Any objections? No objections. You'll stand adjourned until 2 p.m. Members, you do not have to turn off your system. What you can do is just mute your mics and your video. That way, you'll save yourself from any hitches or glitches that may occur if you try and get back on later. Let's just mute everything, and we'll all be online when 2 o'clock comes. Okay? See everyone at 2 o'clock? The House now stands adjourned until 2 p.m. You know. Thank you.